The port looked small on the map. In reality, it became a hinge around which an entire desert campaign turned. In early 1941, the North African War revolved around a few scattered ports, dusty roads, and supply columns hauling fuel measured in hundreds of tons across a landscape where water itself required transport in metal drums. Tobruk sat along the Libyan coast like a stubborn knot in the line. Its harbor could receive ships carrying thousands of tons of supplies. Whoever controlled that port could sustain armies operating hundreds of miles across desert, where trucks burned dozens of gallons of fuel, simply reaching the next staging area. When German forces under Erwin Rommel launched their offensive across Libya, they pushed British and Commonwealth forces back rapidly. Tanks weighing over 20 tons rolled across open desert, supported by artillery firing shells weighing more than 20 pounds each. Supply convoys stretched behind them, carrying gasoline, ammunition crates weighing dozens of pounds, and replacement parts for engines strained by heat and sand. Yet Tobruk did not collapse with the rest of the line. Inside the perimeter stood thousands of soldiers, many from Australian divisions, supported by British artillery units and armored vehicles. The defensive ring around the port extended for miles, consisting of trenches, bunkers, barbed wire, and minefields seeded with explosives capable of tearing open tank tracks or shredding infantry formations advancing through narrow gaps. Rommel attempted to break the defenses quickly. German and Italian forces launched assaults with infantry, supported by tanks and artillery. Bombers dropped explosives weighing several hundred pounds onto defensive positions. Shells exploded across trenches, sending fragments of steel and sand in every direction. Yet each attack collided with a defense built carefully around overlapping fire zones. Inside a defensive trench near the perimeter, an Australian soldier felt the ground vibrate as artillery rounds detonated nearby. The rifle in his hands weighed only a few pounds, yet the ammunition carried in his pack added several more. Sweat mixed with dust beneath a steel helmet, while machine guns nearby fired bursts measured in hundreds of rounds. The defenders soon gained a nickname. German propaganda broadcasts attempted to mock the soldiers trapped inside the Tobruk perimeter, calling them rats hiding in holes. The men inside adopted the label themselves, turning it into a badge of stubborn defiance. They fought from dugouts carved into earth hardened by desert sun, emerging at night to patrol the no-man's land between lines. The siege extended for months. German and Italian units maintained pressure on the perimeter, while attempting to starve the defenders of supplies. Trucks hauling fuel and ammunition for Axis forces had to travel hundreds of miles from ports further west. Each mile consumed precious gasoline. A single armored unit could require hundreds of tons of fuel per week to sustain continuous operations. Meanwhile, the defenders inside Tobruk relied heavily on the sea. British naval vessels ran nightly supply missions into the harbor, delivering ammunition crates, food supplies, and sometimes replacement troops. Ships carried shells weighing over 20 pounds for artillery batteries guarding the perimeter. They also evacuated wounded soldiers, whose injuries required treatment far from the front. Imagine standing on the deck of one of those ships, entering the harbor at night. Engines hum quietly as sailors scan the coastline for flashes of enemy artillery. Crates of ammunition, weighing dozens of pounds, are unloaded quickly, while wounded soldiers are carried aboard stretchers toward waiting medical facilities. Inside the defensive ring, conditions remained brutal. Summer heat pushed temperatures high enough to exhaust soldiers within minutes of strenuous activity. Water rations were measured carefully, sometimes only a few pints per man per day. Flies gathered around food supplies and wounds alike. Artillery shells landed unpredictably, forcing defenders to remain alert, even during moments of quiet. I once studied the daily ration reports from the Tobruk garrison, and what struck me was how precisely everything had to be counted. Water in gallons, ammunition in crates, fuel in drums. When a port is surrounded by hostile forces, survival becomes a calculation repeated every morning. German assaults continued throughout the siege. Armored units attempted to break through the perimeter, with tanks whose armor plates measured several inches thick. Anti-tank guns positioned along the defensive line fired shells capable of piercing that armor at close range. Each clash left wrecked vehicles scattered across desert ground between the lines. Night raids became common. Small groups of defenders crept across the desert under darkness to sabotage enemy positions, or capture prisoners for intelligence. The sound of boots moving across gravel sometimes preceded sudden bursts of gunfire that shattered the quiet desert night. Inside a tank stationed within the Tobruk perimeter, the crew might feel the engine rumble beneath them as they prepared to counterattack an advancing enemy unit. The turret rotated slowly, while the gunner aligned sights on distant shapes emerging through dust clouds, stirred by movement. Despite repeated attacks, the port held. The siege lasted roughly 8 months. During that time, the defenders endured constant bombardment, limited supplies, and the knowledge that relief might take months to arrive. Yet every failed assault by Axis forces consumed fuel, ammunition, and manpower that could not easily be replaced. Eventually, Allied forces advancing from Egypt forced Axis units to pull back from Tobruk. The siege lifted. Soldiers who had spent months inside the perimeter emerged from trenches and dugouts into open desert once more. When I read letters written by Australian soldiers during the siege, I noticed how often they described the same thing: the endless horizon, the dust settling on everything, and the strange quiet moments between bombardments when the desert seemed almost peaceful. Picture the port after the siege ends. Ships move freely in and out of the harbor once again. Soldiers stand along the docks, watching the sun sink over the Mediterranean while the guns finally fall silent. And if you are listening now as the day fades and sleep begins pulling at your thoughts, imagine that same harbor at night during the siege. Dark water reflecting faint starlight, while supply ships glide quietly toward the docks, carrying crates of ammunition and barrels of fuel. This is the entire history of the Rats of Tobruk, the Australian siege in the Second World War. Chapter 1. The Port That Could Not Fall. The 9th of April, 1941. The coastal road between Derna and Tobruk, eastern Libya, somewhere behind a retreating column of dust-covered vehicles, the German Afrika Korps is closing fast. The men of the Australian 9th Division aren't marching toward Tobruk, they're falling back to it. There's a difference. One feels like a decision. The other feels like the last door in a burning building, and someone has just told you it might still be unlocked. The town of Tobruk sits on the eastern Libyan coast in a way that looks, on a map, almost accidental. A small bay curves inward from the Mediterranean, cutting a natural harbor into the otherwise featureless shoreline. The surrounding desert is flat, bleached, and indifferent. There are 2 escarpments, rocky ledges rising above the coastal plain, and beyond them, nothing useful for hundreds of kilometers in any direction. But that harbor, that specific, inconvenient, strategically devastating harbor. The main berth ran to a depth of roughly 11 meters, deep enough for ocean-going vessels of several thousand tons. And it was the only facility of that kind for nearly 1,000 kilometers of Libyan coastline in either direction. That single hydrographic fact is what this story is actually about. Not courage, not cruelty, geography. When I first started working through the planning documents and captured Italian engineering assessments from the late 1930s, I kept returning to one detail that almost nobody mentions in the popular history. The Italians had been thinking seriously about Tobruk's defensibility for years before a single Australian soldier arrived. The colonial garrison had surveyed, mapped, and partially fortified the perimeter with a methodical competence that the Allies were about to inherit entirely by accident. There's an annotation in the captured engineering records, penciled in Italian, almost certainly by a junior technical officer, noting that the anti-tank ditch on the southern approach was incomplete, with a cross-reference to a section report. That marginal note, made by an anonymous man whose name history never recorded, may have been the most consequential piece of military writing produced in Libya between the wars. The ditch's incompleteness would matter enormously, though not yet. The Italian-constructed defensive perimeter ran in a rough semicircle around Tobruk, beginning and ending at the shoreline, averaging roughly 9 miles from the harbor. The Italians had placed barbed wire along much of its length, and had begun the anti-tank ditch, but only begun it. They had also constructed a network of concrete strongpoints, weapons pits flush with the desert floor, connected by deep communication trenches, arranged in a staggered pattern, alternating between forward and rear positions. These weren't improvised fieldworks. The concrete pits were typically designed to accommodate machine gun teams and a single anti-tank weapon, with walls and floors poured to a specification that made them genuinely difficult to destroy from above. When Australian engineers arrived and began surveying what they'd inherited, What they found was a defensive infrastructure that was, in several respects, better than anything they could have built from scratch in the time available. Nobody gave the Italians credit for it. Almost nobody does now. Lieutenant General Leslie Morshead took command of the 9th Division's defense with a directness that his men found either inspiring or terrifying, depending on their proximity to him on any given morning. He was a former schoolmaster from Victoria who had fought at Gallipoli and on the Western Front, and he approached military command with the same quality a good teacher brings to a difficult class: complete refusal to accept work below the standard he knew was possible, combined with an absolutely clear explanation of what that standard was. His men called him Ming the Merciless, after the villain in the Flash Gordon serials, partly because of the trimmed mustache, and partly because he meant every word he said. On approximately the 9th of April, 1941, he gathered his senior officers and issued a command that Chester Wilmot recorded in his 1943 account of the campaign. "There'll be no Dunkirk here," Morshead said. "If we can't go out, we stay." That was the policy. 7 words. The entire 8-month siege is contained in them. The defensive system Morshead and Major General John Laverack formalized in those first frantic days was built on the Italian infrastructure, but extended and refined with a doctrine that was entirely their own. The outer ring, the line of alternating strongpoints that ran the full perimeter, was designated the Red Line. The positions were numbered consecutively. Odd-numbered posts occupied the forward row, even numbers the row behind, each pair positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire into the dead ground between them. 3 miles inside the Red Line sat the Blue Line, manned by reserve formations, and closer to the harbor still, the Green Line as a final fallback. Morshead's standing orders were clear on one point above all others: no ground would voluntarily be surrendered. None. The infantry's role, if tanks broke through, was to remain in their positions, engage the enemy infantry accompanying those tanks, and let the artillery behind the Blue Line deal with the armor. It was a doctrine that required extraordinary discipline from men who would watch panzers roll past their positions and be ordered not to break. It worked, eventually. But first it had to be tested. The artillery available to the garrison was a mixture of British-supplied and captured Italian equipment that tells its own story about the state of Allied logistics in early 1941. 48 25-pounder field guns formed the backbone of the defensive fire plan, supplemented by 12 18-pounders and 12 4.5-inch howitzers. There were British 2-pounder anti-tank guns, but not enough of them, and many Australian units arrived at their positions using captured Italian weapons they'd never trained on. Approximately 60 tanks were available, a mix of cruiser and infantry types, including Matildas, with roughly 30 more under repair. This was the garrison. 14,000 Australians at its heart, several thousand British artillerists, Indian infantry and cavalry, and others. A total force of somewhere between 22 and 25,000, depending on which headquarters document you trust, and on which week of which month the count was taken. What I find consistently underestimated in the secondary literature is the strategic arithmetic that made Tobruk's defense worth the cost before a single shot had been fired in its defense. Rommel's Africa Corps required at minimum several hundred tons of supply per day to sustain an offensive operation toward Egypt and the Suez Canal. That supply had to travel by sea to Tripoli, then overland along the coastal road, a distance of approximately 1,500 kilometers to the forward positions near the Egyptian frontier. Every kilometer of that road consumed fuel. For every ton delivered at the front, considerably more than a ton had to be burned getting it there. If Tobruk fell and its harbor became available, Rommel's supply haul would shorten by more than 1,000 kilometers overnight. The entire strategic calculus of the North African War would shift. So the 11-meter depth of that harbor berth wasn't just a nautical detail. It was the weight of a campaign. The men who came into Tobruk in those early April days knew almost nothing of this arithmetic. They knew they were being told to hold. They knew the road behind them was being cut. They knew the enemy who had just conquered France was now somewhere in the dust behind them, coming at a speed that defied the conventional military wisdom about what a motorized force could sustain across a desert. The 9th Division had existed as a formed unit for less than a year. It had not fought as a complete formation. Its equipment was incomplete. Its training had been interrupted repeatedly by the chaos of the Middle East theater. By any conventional measure, It was not the force you would choose to hold a fortress against the army that had beaten everything it had faced since 1939. Morshead knew all of this. He chose not to mention it. Instead, he walked the perimeter, inspected the incomplete ditch, examined the Italian concrete pits, and started issuing orders. There's a quality to those first days in Tobruk that the official records capture in a kind of compressed, bureaucratic shorthand that almost conceals what was actually happening. The war diaries read like maintenance logs: positions assigned, wire checked, artillery registered, patrols tasked. The orderly, systematic language of an army settling in. But read against the background of what was approaching from the west, that orderliness has a different quality. It reads like calm in a room that is about to receive very bad news. The harbor still worked. The water, though rationed, still flowed. The supply dumps held enough for weeks, and somewhere out in the desert, the dust cloud of the Africa Corps was drawing closer, and Erwin Rommel, a man who had not yet encountered anything that slowed him down, was about to discover that 11 meters of harbor depth and 7 words from a schoolmaster general could do what the armies of France and Britain had failed to do: stop him. Chapter 2. The Desert Fox arrives and is surprised. The 11th of April, 1941, 0800 hours. Somewhere on the desert plains south of Tobruk, a column of vehicles is forming up in the heat that is already, by mid-morning, significant enough to distort the horizon into a liquid shimmer. The 505th Panzer Regiment has received its orders. The orders say, attack. The maps say, there is a perimeter. The maps do not say where the perimeter actually is. The maps are scaled at 1 to 400,000. At that scale, a 12-foot ditch is invisible. Rommel had arrived in North Africa on the 12th of February 1941 at Tripoli, with the leading elements of what would become the Deutsche Afrika Korps. He had been sent to shore up the Italian position, which was collapsing under the weight of General Wavel's early offensive successes. Berlin's intention was that he would conduct a defensive stabilization. Rommel's intention, as became clear within weeks, was considerably more ambitious. By the 31st of March, he was already attacking. By the 9th of April, his forces had covered roughly 800 kilometers in 11 days, a pace of advance that shocked even his own headquarters in Berlin, which had not authorized anything like it. He had swept around British positions, captured Mekili, forced the retreat of the 9th Australian Division, and was now standing before the last obstacle between his forward units and the Egyptian frontier. He expected it to fall quickly. He had reason to. Everything else had. What I find most striking, when I cross-reference the German operational documents from this period with von Mellenthin's post-war memoir, is the specific shape of the intelligence failure that preceded the first Tobruk assault. The Afrika Korps went into the Easter attacks without the Italian defensive plans for the Tobruk perimeter, the documents that would have told them exactly where the anti-tank ditch was complete, where it was shallow, and where it was absent entirely. The Italian High Command had not shared them. Whether this was organizational friction or deliberate withholding is unclear from the surviving record. Von Mellenthin was characteristically diplomatic about it, but the consequence was concrete. German assault planners were working from maps that couldn't show a ditch, without blueprints that would have shown them the ditch's exact configuration, attacking a position they had never properly reconnoitered. The 505th Panzer Regiment's war diary noted that reconnaissance was hampered by aggressive Australian patrolling that prevented close-in ground survey. That's the official explanation. The unofficial one is that Rommel attacked before he was ready, because he couldn't imagine being stopped. Of the approximately 150 panzers that had begun the drive from Mersa el Brega in late March, only around 38 were mechanically fit for combat by the 11th of April. That number comes from post-battle assessments cited in the Miller Staff Ride Study, prepared for the Army University Press. 38 tanks, against a perimeter held by artillery, anti-tank guns, mines, a ditch, and an infantry that had been told it would not retreat. The discrepancy between the force that had conquered Cyrenaica and the force that actually arrived at Tobruk's wire is one of the genuine revelations of the supply and maintenance record. The Panzer III, which formed the backbone of the regiment's striking power, was powered by a Maybach 120 engine mated to a crash gearbox transmission that was not designed for the sustained high-speed movement across rocky desert track that Rommel had demanded of it. Sand infiltrated the air filtration systems. Oil temperatures ran high. Fuel consumption per kilometer in desert conditions ran at roughly double the European baseline. The tanks that reached Tobruk had not been serviced. They hadn't had time. General Streich, commanding the 5th Light Division, had requested a pause for maintenance and rest. Rommel had refused. The attack on the afternoon of the 11th of April began at approximately 1500 hours, when the 505th Panzer Regiment moved up from its assembly area and came immediately under observed artillery fire. Within the first hour, Australian gunners reported destroying 5 German tanks at roughly 1,000 yards from the outer strongpoints. The initial assault probed the sector held by the 2nd 17th and 2nd 13th Battalions. The section of perimeter centered on the El Adem Road, the main route running south from Tobruk toward the interior. German infantry, perhaps 700 men, moved toward the wire at roughly 4 in the afternoon. The Australians opened up with machine guns and rifles. The infantry went to ground. Then the tanks came. 25 panzers moved up to the anti-tank ditch and found it impassable. They turned east, looking for a crossing. The artillery followed them. Every correction call went through, because the Australian forward observation posts had by this point registered virtually every piece of ground within range, and the gunners knew where the tanks were going before the tanks knew it themselves. What happened next is one of the small, precise ironies of the campaign. Captain Balfe, commanding D Company of the 2nd 17th Battalion, had been watching the German tanks from his position and had concluded, based on what he could see, that the ditch in front of his company was not deep enough to stop them. He filed this assessment in his after-action report. He was wrong, or rather, the ditch was deep enough in his sector, but the Germans had already reached the same mistaken conclusion he had, and had moved east looking for a shallower section. Both sides, simultaneously, had misread the same piece of engineering. The tanks broke off and moved toward the 2nd 13th sector. The Australians adjusted their artillery. By early evening, the first day's assault was effectively over, with the Germans having been repelled by a combination of the unexpected ditch, heavy artillery fire, and an anti-tank capability that Rommel had not believed the garrison possessed at this strength. It had been, from the German side, a confused, costly, and humiliating afternoon. When I was working through Rommel's personal correspondence from this period, the letters to his wife Lucy that were published post-war, I found the entry for the middle of April, 1941, notably restrained. He writes about the operational situation in terms that are notably more circumspect than his earlier letters from France and the opening weeks of the Desert Campaign. There's no triumphant declaration that Tobruk will fall tomorrow. There's a kind of tight-jawed acknowledgement that the situation is not yet resolved. For a man whose letters are generally buoyant with confidence, the shift in register is telling. He'd found something that didn't move when he pushed it. He hadn't found this before. He wasn't quite sure what to do with the information. The second day, the 12th of April, passed without a major assault. The Germans were trying to formulate a new plan, but they were working against 2 serious constraints: the poor maps that couldn't accurately represent the ditch's configuration, and the absence of the Italian defensive blueprints that would have told them where to look for weak points. A German engineer officer conducted a ground reconnaissance and reported finding a section of the perimeter without an anti-tank ditch, a report that was based on distant observation and proved incorrect. 24 tanks were dispatched on the afternoon of the 12th toward this supposed gap, with engineers attached to breach any obstacles. They came under artillery fire immediately. The engineers, despite what the official report called considerable bravery under fire, could not reach the wire. By 1645, the assault had run into the ditch they'd been told wasn't there. The tanks waited 15 minutes under continuous fire. Then they withdrew. The German intelligence failure at Tobruk had a specific technical dimension that is rarely examined in detail. The Luftwaffe's Fliegerkorps X, which was providing air support for the Afrika Korps, had a total available strength of approximately 250 aircraft on operational days, a mix of Junkers 87 Stukas, level bombers, and fighter cover. But aerial photography at the resolution required to identify a 12-foot ditch in sandy desert terrain requires a specific combination of low-altitude flight, adequate shadow angle, and interpretation expertise that the available German photographic intelligence capacity could not reliably deliver. The maps, the aerial photographs, and the ground reconnaissance had all failed to accurately characterize the ditch. And because the ditch was the central physical feature of the entire defensive scheme, every assault plan built on inaccurate knowledge of it was built on sand, literally. The third assault, the Easter battle proper, on the night of the 13th into the morning of the 14th of April, was the most carefully planned of the three. It was also the most costly. What's remarkable, reading the German and Australian accounts of that night side by side, is how clearly both sides understood they were approaching something decisive. The German artillery preparation was heavier, the infantry more numerous, the engineering support more deliberate. But the Australians had spent 48 hours reinforcing, mining, registering new artillery targets, and preparing counterattack formations. Morshead had ordered the reserve formation closer to the perimeter. The patrols had been warning him all night that something was coming. When the 505th Panzer Regiment finally crossed the anti-tank ditch in the early hours of the 14th, using a fog that had descended to give them partial cover, they drove into a box that was waiting for them. Not a trap, exactly. Something more like a prepared certainty. Chapter 3. The Arithmetic of Survival. A Logistics Chapter. Alexandria Harbor. The 23rd of May, 1941. 0200 hours. HMAS. Vendetta is making ready to sail. Her decks are stacked with ammunition crates. Her forward mess decks have been stripped of their bunks and filled with sacks of rations. Her torpedo tubes have been rigged with cargo nets. Below, in the magazine spaces, a working party of sailors is shifting boxes in darkness, by touch and memory, to trim the ship's center of gravity. She is carrying roughly 142 tons of ammunition alone. Her total cargo load is somewhere close to 190 tons. She draws more water than usual. She rides a little heavy, and by the time she clears the harbor entrance, the horizon ahead is empty and dark. In approximately 7 hours, if the Stukas don't find her, she'll be in Tobruk. The Tobruk ferry service is probably the least cinematically exciting component of the entire siege, which is almost certainly why it receives a fraction of the historical attention that the land battles do. Nobody makes films about fuel manifests and cargo manifests. But when I was working through the Royal Australian Navy's operational records for the siege period, I kept encountering a number that reframed everything else I'd been reading. The ferry service, across the full duration of the siege, completed approximately 139 destroyer runs between Alexandria and Tobruk. HMAS Vendetta alone made 39 of those runs. 39 individual nights of sailing into a harbor under Axis air observation, unloading by hand in complete darkness, and sailing back before dawn. In aggregate, the service delivered an estimated 33,946 tons of military stores to the garrison. 33,946 tons. That is the arithmetic of survival. That is why the rats of Tobruk didn't starve. The minimum daily supply requirement for a garrison of approximately 25,000 men, together with their weapons and vehicles, was estimated at around 200 tons per day. The ferry service delivered, across the siege, an average of roughly 140 tons per run, with runs occurring on most but not all nights, depending on weather and Axis interdiction. This means there were sustained periods, particularly in June and July of 1941, when Axis air power over the Mediterranean was at its most aggressive, when the garrison was consuming from stockpile at rates that left only a handful of days reserve. The margin between operational sustainability and humanitarian crisis was, on several occasions, measurable in single digits, not weeks, days. This is the detail that changes your understanding of what the men inside Tobruk were experiencing in the summer of 1941. They weren't just under fire, they were also, intermittently, close to running out. The technical constraints on the ferry operation were embedded in the physics of the destroyer itself. HMAS Vendetta was a V-class destroyer, displacing 1,090 tons standard, capable of 34 knots when fully worked up and lightly loaded. For a Tobruk run, she was neither light nor fast. Fully loaded with cargo, ammunition stacked in magazine spaces, rations in mess decks, medical stores wherever they'd fit. She was slower and sat lower in the water, making her marginally more vulnerable to air attack and considerably more difficult to handle in the swell conditions that occasionally accompanied the run. The crew rigged cargo nets over the torpedo tube mounts to carry additional deck cargo, and the forward mess deck surfaces were covered with ammunition boxes, stacked 4 layers high. Loading at Alexandria took approximately 4 hours. Unloading at Tobruk, in complete darkness, with no dock lights and no crane, by hand, man by man, box by box, also took approximately 4 hours. The ship was in the harbor for less time than it takes to watch a long film. Then it turned around and went back. The Tobruk run operated at night for the obvious reason that the Mediterranean in daytime, within range of Axis airfields in Libya and Crete, was extremely dangerous for a lone destroyer. The standard approach was to depart Alexandria in late afternoon, make the roughly 450-kilometer crossing during the night, arrive at Tobruk between 0200 and 0400 hours, unload, load returning casualties and evacuees, and depart before dawn. This schedule was not merely preferred, it was operationally essential. On runs where delays in unloading pushed the departure time past first light, the ships faced immediate air attack on the outward voyage. The Axis air presence over the coastal waters was sufficiently persistent that daylight sailing was close to suicidal for a vessel moving alone without air cover. The sailors of the ferry service didn't talk about courage, as far as the records suggest. They talked about timing. It fascinates me, and I mean this as a researcher rather than a rhetorician, that HMAS Parramatta is almost completely absent from the popular memory of the Tobruk siege. She was a sloop, slower and less glamorous than the destroyers, and she was torpedoed on the 27th of November, 1941, by a German submarine designated U-559. 138 of her 163-man crew were lost. She went down not on a supply run carrying ammunition or food. She was escorting a water tanker, a vessel called Hana, carrying fresh water to the garrison. Fresh water, the single most irreplaceable commodity inside the perimeter, where the daily personal ration for every purpose was 3.5 liters per man. Parramatta was sunk protecting the water supply, on the same day that Operation Crusader began its opening moves, and the land battle was so large and so consequential that the naval action was effectively buried in the news cycle before it had been reported. 138 men. The water tanker made it. HMAS. Waterhen's loss on the 30th of June, 1941, is better documented, partly because she was the first Royal Australian Navy ship lost in the Second World War, and that status demanded a certain formal attention in the records. She was attacked by Axis dive bombers on her 13th run to Tobruk, taken under tow, and sank approximately 50 kilometers off the coast. No lives were lost among her crew, which the records suggest was partly a result of disciplined damage control procedures, and partly the fact that she was already listing when the final attack came, and the crew had prepared for abandonment. What the formal records don't capture, and what you only find in the later oral histories collected by the Naval History section, is the peculiar institutional grief that a crew carries when its ship goes down from underneath it. Waterhen's crew transferred to other vessels and continued the ferry service. The ship was irreplaceable in sentiment. In terms of cargo capacity, she was replaced within days. The human dimension of the naval operation sat in the same compartments as the cargo. On the inbound run, the destroyers carried reinforcements, replacement ammunition, medical supplies, and occasionally letters and newspapers, the latter arriving weeks old, bound from Australia to the Middle East, and then across the Mediterranean, by whatever means were available. On the outward run, they carried the wounded from the garrison's medical posts, men who'd been assessed as too badly injured to continue serving, and, in the rotation phases of August through October 1941, entire battalions of Australian soldiers transferring out of the perimeter to be replaced by British units. The destroyers that had been ammunition ships one week became troop ships the next. The logistics of the rotation operation, moving approximately 14,000 men in and out while simultaneously maintaining the supply of a garrison under active fire, consumed the equivalent of dozens of additional runs over the rotation period. The naval arithmetic of the rotation has never been fully calculated in published histories. It was considerable. The costs paid by the Navy for the ferry service was 32 ships lost or damaged across the various supply operations in the wider Tobruk support effort. 2 Australian destroyers, 3 sloops including Parramatta, 21 smaller vessels. The personnel losses among naval crews engaged in ferry operations are rarely aggregated in the land-focused histories of the siege, but they were substantial. The men who kept the garrison alive were doing so at sustained risk, in an operational environment where Axis air power operated with considerable effectiveness during daylight hours, and where submarine threat was persistent throughout. They did it 139 times. The garrison inside the wire tended to know when a ferry run was due. They were men who listened for the particular sound of a destroyer's engines in the harbor, and who felt, in a way that's difficult to describe precisely, but is consistent across oral history accounts, a specific quality of reassurance at that sound. The night wasn't silent. The ship was there. The ammunition had arrived. Tomorrow was still possible. Chapter 4. Ming the Merciless, the Man Who Built a Doctrine. Ballarat, Victoria, 1905. A schoolroom. A young man named Leslie James Morshead is teaching English composition to secondary students. He is 17 years their senior, probably, in terms of emotional development. He demands precise work. He marks it accordingly. He is not unkind, but he doesn't confuse kindness with leniency, and his students appear to have understood the difference, though they may not have appreciated it at the time. It's worth sitting with this image for a moment. The man who would eventually hold the longest successful defensive siege in Commonwealth military history during the Second World War, standing in front of a classroom in regional Victoria, teaching children to express themselves clearly. The classroom and the command post are not as different as they seem. Morshead was born in 1889 in Ballarat, the son of a carpenter, and trained as a teacher before enlisting in 1914. He served at Gallipoli as a company commander with the 2nd Battalion, then transferred to the Western Front, where he commanded at the battalion level through the grinding attritional fighting of 1917 and 1918. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Order and Bar, a decoration that requires something more than the routine exercise of command to obtain. After the war, he returned to teaching, maintained an active reserve commission, and built a parallel career in business, eventually working in shipping, while continuing to train with the militia. By 1939, he was one of the most experienced citizen soldiers in Australia. When the 2nd AIF was formed and the 9th Division was assembled, Morshead was given command of the division. His men inherited him. They weren't given the option of returning him. The nickname Ming the Merciless came from a combination of his appearance. The trimmed mustache genuinely did resemble the Flash Gordon villains, and his operational personality, which was defined by an absolute and non-negotiable standard in everything. Chester Wilmot, who observed Morshead at close range throughout the siege, noted something that I think gets to the heart of what made him effective in this specific situation. It is popularly believed that Morshead is a hard man. He is. But he is hard because he believes that a man who has been trained hard, fights hard, and dies less. That formulation, the connection between demanding standards and minimized casualties, is the intellectual core of Morshead's command philosophy, and it came directly from the Western Front, where he had watched men die in numbers that seemed, to officers who understood what careful preparation could prevent, at least partly preventable. He never forgot that lesson. He applied it in Libya with what the records suggest was a completeness that occasionally left his subordinate commanders exhausted, and his soldiers simultaneously resentful and grateful. The doctrine Morshead established for the Tobruk defense is documented most clearly in the garrison policy papers held in the Australian War Memorial Collection, a series of typed orders and handwritten annotations that together constitute the operational intellectual framework of the entire siege. The standing orders were specific in ways that mattered. No ground surrendered voluntarily, aggressive patrols beyond the perimeter every night, infantry to remain in position if tanks penetrated and engage the accompanying enemy infantry, artillery positioned and laid for the anti-tank role, as well as the standard fire support role. A mobile reserve of tanks, artillery, and anti-tank guns prepared to respond to any penetration. The phrase that Wilmot records Morshead using with his brigade commanders, "If the enemy gets into our lines, he will not get out again," wasn't rhetoric. It was a technical description of the fire plan. The artillery behind the blue line was pre-registered on the ground between the red line and the town. Anything that penetrated the perimeter would be engaging a landscape that had been methodically prepared to destroy it. The night patrol culture that Morshead imposed on the garrison deserves specific attention because it's frequently described in terms of morale, as evidence of an aggressive spirit, a refusal to be passive. But it had a technical function that was equally important. The 9th Division's war diaries record more than 200 named patrol actions between April and August of 1941, ranging from two-man listening posts, close to the wire, to company-strength raids several kilometers into no man's land. These operations served a primary purpose that was essentially cartographic. They built and continuously updated a detailed knowledge of German and Italian positions, approach routes, equipment deployments, and patterns of behavior. Every German position change, every new entrenchment, every shift in vehicle concentration. The patrols found it, reported it, and the intelligence was added to the picture. By June, the garrison's forward artillery observers and their counterpart patrol commanders knew the ground between the wire and the Axis positions with a precision that no Axis reconnaissance had been able to match. The German maps showed a perimeter. The Australians knew a landscape. When I was working through the records of the patrol program in detail, one passage in an after-action report from the 2nd 23rd Battalion caught my attention, partly because of what it described and partly because of how casually the description was written. The flat, bureaucratic register of a unit that has normalized something extraordinary. The report describes a patrol that had moved to within 100 yards of a German listening post, identified the specific weapons emplaced at that post, and returned with this information without being detected. The patrol had taken approximately 4 hours. It had been conducted in darkness, on foot, across ground that contained both Allied and enemy mines, whose exact positions were marked only imperfectly on the maps the patrol carried. The report rated the patrol as satisfactory. Not exceptional, not remarkable, satisfactory. That word, in that context, tells you something important about what Mooreshead had built in 4 months. To me, the most revealing document in the Mooreshead archive isn't a battle order or a tactical appreciation. It's a short message that he sent to his garrison, distributed through unit commanders, in late April of 1941, after the Easter Battle. It reads, in part, "We are not going to fail. If the enemy gets into our lines, he will not get out again." The message is short enough to be memorized. It makes a specific promise. It doesn't ask anything of the men receiving it. No appeals to honor or tradition, no rhetorical questions about what the moment demands. It states an outcome. Mooreshead understood, and I think his years as a teacher gave him this understanding more directly than any military course could, that the most useful thing a leader can do for people facing genuine danger is give them a specific, believable statement of what will happen, not an emotional appeal to how they should feel about it. The men inside Tobruk were frightened, exhausted, undersupplied, and operating in conditions of genuine uncertainty. What they needed was not inspiration. What they needed was a credible framework. Mooreshead gave them one. The command tension that developed between Mooreshead and the British High Command is documented most clearly in the diplomatic and military cable traffic of mid-1941, when the question of the garrison's rotation began to dominate correspondence between Canberra, Cairo, and London. Mooreshead's formal reports on the garrison's condition, the medical assessments, the operational readiness evaluations, were honest to the point of diplomatic inconvenience. He reported what he found. What he found by July was a division that had been operating at high intensity in extreme conditions for 4 months without relief, with an accumulating medical burden from disease and combat injury that was eroding effective strength below the nominal order of battle strength. He reported this. The British command interpreted the reporting as a political maneuver. The Australian War Cabinet interpreted it as operational necessity. Both interpretations contained some truth, which is why the argument took as long to resolve as it did. The question of whether Mooreshead's request for rotation was driven by genuine operational assessment or by the Australian War Cabinet's political calculations is one of the genuine open questions in the historiography of the siege. David Horner's biography of Mooreshead suggests that the general himself initially preferred to keep his division together in Tobruk rather than be rotated out piecemeal, that the division's coherence as a formation was, in his view, a military asset worth preserving, even at the cost of remaining in place. If that's accurate, it complicates the conventional narrative considerably. It suggests that the political pressure for rotation came from Canberra rather than from the man on the ground, and that the operational justification was assembled after the political decision had been made. I'm not entirely convinced by this reading. The medical records are too consistent with genuine exhaustion, but the uncertainty is real, and it's worth naming. Mooreshead left Tobruk with the bulk of his division in September of 1941. He had been there since the 9th of April. He had watched more than 700 of his men buried in the desert cemetery that was growing on the edge of the town. He had not, in 5 months of continuous siege, surrendered a single meter of ground that he'd been ordered to hold, with the partial exception of the Ras el Medauar Salient, which the records suggest troubled him considerably, and which he discussed in terms that were markedly less settled than the confident public posture he maintained. When the last of the Australians, the 2nd 13th Battalion, finally walked out of the perimeter in December of 1941, having been there for the full 242 days, they were in some sense still operating on Mooreshead's standing orders. No ground surrendered, aggressive patrol. The enemy gets in, he doesn't get out. The schoolmaster had taught them well. Chapter 5. Easter Monday. Tanks in the Wire. The night of the 13th of April, 1941, Post R33, on the Red Line perimeter of Tobruk. 0100 hours. A small group of Australian soldiers is watching the wire from a concrete position that measures roughly 80 feet across and sits flush with the desert floor. Outside the wire, somewhere in the darkness, there are German engineers. The Australians know this because their patrols have come back in the last 2 hours with reports of movement. Infantry at the anti-tank ditch, sappers working on the wire. The post commander has fired his Ferry pistol. A green flare climbing into the dark, calling for artillery. The 25-pounder shells will arrive in seconds. The shells arrive. And somewhere out there in the dark, the Germans keep working. The Easter battle, the engagement that ran across the 13th and 14th of April, 1941, was not the garrison's first contact with the Afrika Korps. 2 preliminary assaults had already been repelled in the preceding days. The probe of the 11th of April that had found the anti-tank ditch where the Germans expected a gap, and the reconnaissance in force of the 12th that had run into the same ditch again despite an engineer's report that it wasn't there. Rommel had ordered a 3rd assault to begin on the evening of the 13th, this time with better planning, a proper artillery preparation, and the full available strength of the 5th Panzer Regiment, supported by the 8th Machine Gun Battalion. The attack would cross the anti-tank ditch near Post R33, a section held by D Company of the 2nd 17th Battalion, commanded by Captain Harold Balfe, and drive north through the perimeter to seize the road junction at the El Adam crossroads. From there, the tanks would push northwest toward Fort Pilestrino, and, if the plan held, through to Tobruk harbor before dawn. What I find most striking about the German assault plan, when I read it against what actually happened, is how close it came to working. Not because it was a good plan, but because the conditions that night briefly favored the attacker in a way that the previous 2 nights hadn't. A fog descended over the Tobruk perimeter in the early hours of the 14th of April, at the critical moment when the 505th Panzer Regiment's 2 battalions were crossing the anti-tank ditch, one at a time, through a breach opened by engineers. The fog reduced visibility to the point where concentrated artillery fire on the crossing point was difficult to maintain with the accuracy the previous defenses had relied upon. Approximately 38 panzers crossed the ditch and formed up inside the perimeter. They were in. The fog was their window. It was also, as it turned out, the entirety of their advantage. The technical reality of what happened next, when the panzers drove north toward the Blue Line, is captured in Lieutenant Joachim Schorm's diary entry, which was published in a post-war collection of German soldiers' accounts. Schorm was an officer in the 6th Company of the Tank Regiment, and his entry for the morning of the 14th of April reads, "We are right in the middle of it, with no prospect of getting out. From both flanks, armor-piercing shells whiz by at 1,000 meters per second. Above us, Italian fighter planes come into the fray. 2 of them crash in our midst." That phrase, "no prospect of getting out," is the voice of a professional soldier who has just driven into a prepared killing ground and understands precisely what that means. The 32 25-pounder guns behind the Blue Line were depressed to 0 elevation and firing direct. The artillery rounds weren't landing near the tanks. They were hitting them. High explosive shells detonating against 30 millimeters of armor at ranges under 500 meters were lethal even without armor-piercing shot, through concussion alone. When the panzers tried to break east, Porte-mounted 2-pounder anti-tank guns, weapons carried on trucks for mobility, moved around the flanks and began engaging from the sides. When the panzers turned east, the 1st Royal Tank Regiment's cruiser tanks appeared and cut off that exit. The box was closed. The fight at Post R33 itself, during the night before the tank breakthrough, produced the first Victoria Cross awarded to an Australian soldier in the Second World War. Corporal John Hurst Edmondson, of the 2nd 17th Battalion, was 27 years old. A group of approximately 30 German soldiers had positioned themselves 100 yards east of Post R33, carrying 8 machine guns, 2 light cannon, and a mortar. More than enough firepower to suppress a single outpost of the standard manning level. When the outpost commander concluded that the German force could not be driven back by fire from the position, he led a counterattack with 6 men, Edmondson among them. The Victoria Cross citation, published in the London Gazette of the 5th of July, 1941, records that Edmondson, although himself wounded in the abdomen and throat, continued to press home his attack, killing several of the enemy with bayonet and rifle butt. The German unit was broken, a prisoner was taken, and 12 enemy soldiers were left dead on the ground. Edmondson died of his wounds before dawn. His citation is a document of almost unbearable compression, a man's final hours reduced to 140 words and a metal code. The aftermath of the tank breakthrough, the destruction of 17 of the 38 panzers inside the perimeter, the capture of over 100 German infantry at a cluster of ruins the records call Goshen's House, the disciplined German withdrawal through the same gap they'd entered, is well documented in both the Australian and German accounts. What's less often examined is the specific mechanics of the firebox that destroyed the panzers. The Panzer III Ausf H had a maximum frontal armor thickness of 30 millimeters, which was adequate against most anti-tank weapons of 1941 at normal combat ranges. The 25-pounder firing direct high-explosive rounds over open sights at under 500 meters was not a weapon it had been designed to face. Nor was the 2-pounder Porte, which fired armor-piercing shot at a muzzle velocity of 853 meters per second, capable of penetrating more than 50 millimeters of armor at 500 meters, well beyond what the Panzer III's protection could absorb. The Matilda II infantry tanks that joined the action had 78 millimeters of frontal armor, which the German 50 millimeter main gun could not reliably penetrate at the ranges of this engagement. All 3 Allied weapons systems were simultaneously working against the tanks. There was no answer that the German armor could give to all 3 at once. When I was reading Rommel's correspondence from the days immediately following Easter, I was struck by how quickly he moved to reframe the engagement in his own mind and in his reports to Berlin. The Easter attacks are described, in a post-war German assessment by Major General Alfred Tope, as raids that failed because the forces available were inadequate for the task. It's a masterpiece of institutional face-saving. The forces were not raids. They were full combined arms assaults with artillery preparation, engineering support, and the full available armor of the division. What Top's language is doing, and what Rommel's subsequent correspondence does in a more subtle version of the same maneuver, is converting a tactical defeat into a resource problem. If the forces were simply inadequate, then the solution is more forces, and the plan was sound. The alternative framing, that the plan was poor, the intelligence was worse, and the garrison was better than anyone had believed, was not one that the Africa Corps was prepared to absorb fully in April of 1941. They would learn it slowly over the following months. The body count at the end of Easter Monday tells a story that resists the mythologizing that sometimes attaches to these events. Allied casualties for the battle were 26 dead, 24 wounded, 4 tanks lost, 1 artillery piece. German and Italian losses were approximately 150 killed, 250 captured, 29 tanks destroyed. Those numbers are not identical in every source. The German figures in particular are contested, with the Axis official records suggesting lower numbers than the Allied count of physically present prisoners and destroyed equipment. I'm inclined to trust the Allied figures for the simple reason that they're anchored in material evidence. Prisoners were counted in person. Tanks were photographed and tallied. The German figures read more like estimates made under the pressure of needing to report to a commander who was not in a good mood. Rommel ordered another attack for 1800 hours on the 14th of April. He couldn't assemble the force. The attack was cancelled. In his diary that night, he wrote, "The fortress must fall." It was a statement of will. It was not, as things turned out, a statement of fact. At Goshen's House, the cluster of ruins north of the outpost line, where the trapped German infantry had taken shelter after the tank withdrawal, the final capture took place in late morning on the 14th. D Company of the 2nd 15th Battalion, supported by elements of the 2nd 17th, assaulted the position with the same tools that had worked all night. Grenades thrown forward, bayonets fixed, rifles firing on the move. More than 75 German soldiers were captured there, having held through the morning in a position with no exit and no supply. Some of them had been inside the perimeter for nearly 12 hours. The Australian prisoners who had been taken briefly by the German tanks during the night breakout, some of them captured by panzers and loaded onto the tanks during the withdrawal, had jumped free in the confusion and run back to their own lines during the tank withdrawal. In the smoke and noise of the German retreat, the tank commanders had apparently not noticed. The prisoners came home through the same gap the panzers came through. History doesn't always produce symmetry, but occasionally it does. The Easter Battle was the first time in the Second World War that a German armored assault had been not merely slowed but destroyed from within, entering a perimeter in sufficient strength to threaten the defense, and being reduced by more than 40% before escaping. The 9th Division had existed as a formed fighting unit for less than a year. It had not fought as a complete formation before Tobruk. Its equipment was incomplete, its training had been compressed, and it had been occupying its defensive positions for less than a week when the first assault came. By any conventional military assessment, it should not have been able to do what it did, but Mooreshead had given it a doctrine that worked. The ditch held the tanks, the artillery killed them, the infantry held their positions and let the plan execute. It worked because the plan had been designed to work, not because the men were specially brave, though they were, and not because the Germans were specially careless, though they were that too. It worked because a schoolmaster from Ballarat had thought very carefully about how to kill tanks, and his soldiers had believed him. Chapter 6. The Weight of Ordinary Days. The 22nd of May, 1941. Somewhere beneath the Tobruk escarpment, in a cistern that the Italian colonial administration had built to store water, a soldier is writing a letter. The cistern has been repurposed. It holds a platoon's worth of sleeping equipment now, a lamp powered by a portable generator, several ammunition boxes used as furniture, and a temperature that is roughly 12 degrees cooler than the surface above. The surface, at this hour of the afternoon, is somewhere above 40 degrees Celsius. The soldier is writing to his mother. He is describing the stars. The gap between the official record of the Tobruk siege and the private record is wider, in this middle period, May through August of 1941, than at almost any other point in the campaign. The war diaries of this period are professional, even-toned documents of operational routine. Patrol reports, supply returns, artillery fire records, casualty summaries. They document a garrison functioning according to its doctrine. What they don't document, what they structurally cannot document, is what it actually felt like to be inside Tobruk for the 115th consecutive day, eating the same tinned ration for the 4th time that week, lying in the heat listening to the artillery that had been intermittently incoming since April and showed no signs of stopping. For that, you go to the letters. And the letters are different from the war diaries in ways that matter enormously. Private correspondence from Tobruk, held in collections at the Australian War Memorial and reproduced in the DVA's Anzac Portal Oral History Project, reveals a world that the official record treats as background texture, but which was, for the men living it, the primary experience of the siege. Food is a constant subject. The ration was, officially, adequate. The official definition of adequate and the soldier's definition of adequate occupy different categories of meaning. The standard garrison diet in the summer months consisted predominantly of tinned bully beef, hard biscuits, tinned jam, and occasional dehydrated vegetables. In temperatures regularly exceeding 40 degrees Celsius, tinned bully beef develops a texture and a smell that the letters describe with a specificity that suggests deeply embedded sensory memory. The dehydrated vegetables rehydrated imperfectly in the limited water available for cooking. The hard biscuits were exactly as described. Several letters mention that men were saving portions of their rations for later in the day, not from discipline, but because eating in the midday heat made them feel worse. The body under siege adapts, but it doesn't pretend. The water ration was 3.5 liters per man per day for all purposes: drinking, cooking, washing. 3.5 liters. A typical adult at rest, in moderate conditions, requires somewhere between 2 and 3 liters of drinking water alone. In a desert environment with temperatures regularly above 40 degrees, during physical activity, including patrol work, the minimum intake to avoid heat illness is considerably higher. The ration was not comfortable. It was the minimum possible, given what the ferry could deliver, and men managed it with an ingenuity that surfaces repeatedly in the oral history accounts. Rationing the morning allocation carefully, saving a portion for the end of the day, learning which times of day a mouthful of water produced the greatest benefit. Trench foot was paradoxically common, caused not by wet conditions but by sand abrasion and the complete absence of foot-washing water. The medical unit's records show it as a persistent, low-level burden throughout the summer months. The medical picture of the garrison in the summer of 1941 is one of the most consistently misrepresented aspects of the siege. The standard narrative, which emphasizes the Easter battle and the subsequent tactical operations, implies a primarily combat-related casualty burden. The Tobruk Medical Unit's war diary tells a different story. By June, dysentery, sandfly fever, and fly-borne eye infections were the primary drivers of hospital admissions, consistently exceeding battle casualties in number. Sandfly fever, caused by the bite of a mite smaller than 3 millimeters, that standard mosquito netting cannot exclude, produced 3 to 5 days of fever, severe headache, and muscular incapacitation in affected soldiers. The disease wasn't fatal, but at an estimated incidence rate of approximately 20% of the garrison over the summer months, it meant that at any given time, several thousand men were effectively non-operational due to illness. The nominal order of battle strength of the garrison, the number on paper, was consistently higher than the actual number of men capable of conducting operations. The difference was sandfly fever, dysentery, and infected eyes. The mail system, which operated through the ferry service with all the irregularity that implied, was the garrison's primary psychological connection to the outside world. Letters were censored by battalion intelligence officers before dispatch. Specific information about location, unit designations, and operational matters was removed. But the censorship was applied to specific content, rather than general communication. And the letters that pass through it are, reading them now, recognizably human documents, rather than sanitized institutional communications. Several letters in the AWM collection show the characteristic mark of the censor, a line of black ink over 4 or 5 words, the surrounding text remaining intact. These redactions are themselves a form of evidence. They mark the point where the soldier's private communication encountered the military's security requirements, and the location of the mark often tells you something about what the soldier was trying to say. Men developed circumlocutions. They referenced places by the number of hours' drive from a city they'd been before. They mentioned weather conditions. They described what they could see from a specific direction. When I was going through the oral history transcripts in the Australians at War Film Archive, a collection of recorded interviews with veterans conducted from the 1990s onward, I kept encountering a specific quality of memory about the underground spaces of Tobruk that didn't appear in any of the formal historical accounts. The caves and cisterns beneath the escarpment weren't just shelter. They were, over months of occupation, transformed into something that functioned as a kind of parallel settlement. There was a cinema, a projector belonging to a South Australian soldier, rigged in a former Italian water cistern, powered by a portable generator, screening films that had made their way to the garrison via the ferry. A cricket documentary is mentioned in multiple accounts as having been shown repeatedly. There was, confirmed in the 2nd 23rd Battalion's war diary, a debating society that met weekly with a formal chairman, timed speeches, and a record of motions. One motion, recorded in the diary, was whether cricket was superior to war. The debates were apparently well attended. The garrison, having been told it couldn't leave, had started to build a community. To me, the detail about the debating society is one of the most psychologically significant facts in the entire Tobruk archive. It doesn't appear in the battle narratives. It doesn't appear in the strategic histories. It barely appears in the unit history of the battalion itself, mentioned almost in passing as a footnote to more martial activities. But what it represents is something that military psychology has spent decades trying to understand in clinical terms, and that these men implemented instinctively. The creation of structured, rule-governed social activity to maintain a sense of normalized existence under conditions that were anything but normal. A debate has a format. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It has rules about who speaks and for how long. It produces a winner and a loser, according to a criterion that has nothing to do with artillery or patrol routes or water rationing. For the 90 minutes that the debate ran, the men in that cistern were not soldiers in a siege. They were citizens in a hall, arguing about cricket. The cognitive relief that this produced, and the accounts suggest it was genuinely relieving, is not sentimental. It's structural. The sound environment of Tobruk in the summer of 1941 is described in oral histories with a consistency that suggests it became, over months, something the garrison integrated rather than reacted to. The artillery was intermittent throughout the day and night, sometimes heavy, sometimes a single gun registering, sometimes absent for hours before resuming. The incoming rounds could be heard before they arrived. Experienced soldiers developed an unconscious auditory classification of sounds by type and likely trajectory. The aircraft came at irregular intervals, the Stukas in particular, with their screaming dive that veterans describe as an acoustic instrument of considerable psychological effect. After a period of weeks, the garrison's medical records suggest that most men had developed a functional habituation to the noise that allowed them to sleep through moderate incoming fire and wake at a specific acoustic threshold that indicated immediate danger. This is an adaptation that the body makes under sustained threat, and it is physiologically real. It is also, when the threat eventually ends, one of the hardest things to reverse. Men who left Tobruk after months inside the perimeter described difficulty sleeping in quiet rooms, a persistent low-level alertness that had no object once the siege was over. In the letters from the summer of 1941, the fleas are mentioned at least as often as the Germans. This is not because the fleas were more dangerous, they weren't, but because they were more constant. The desert flea population around Tobruk, augmented by the presence of tens of thousands of unwashed men and animals in a relatively confined area, was formidable by any measure. The men slept in their clothes. They couldn't wash their clothes because of the water ration. They couldn't avoid the fleas because the fleas were everywhere. In one letter from the DVA collection, a soldier from the 2nd 13th Battalion ranks the fleas above the Germans in his personal hierarchy of discomforts, with a tone of perfect deadpan that feels entirely authentic. It isn't humor deployed to process trauma, it's honest. The fleas were worse than the Germans, in the daily life sense, because the Germans came at specific times and for specific reasons, and the fleas came always and for no reason at all. The garrison adapted. The fleas did not. The underground newspaper called The Tobruk Truth, a mimeographed single sheet produced by a former Melbourne journalist serving with the 9th Division, is confirmed in multiple oral histories and in Chester Wilmot's 1943 account, but has never been fully reproduced in any published history of the siege. If surviving copies exist in the Australian War Memorial Archive, they have not been digitized as of the time of writing. This is a gap in the primary record that matters, because the newspaper was both a genuine information channel, reprinting BBC bulletin extracts received by Garrison Wireless, and a form of cultural production that tells you something about what the men inside Tobruk needed from their environment beyond tactical briefings and ration schedules. They needed to be told, repeatedly and in a recognizable format, that the world outside still existed and that their connection to it was maintained. The newspaper did this. The Ferry did this. The letters did this. The debating society did this. By the end of the summer, the men inside Tobruk had built, largely without instruction, a functional model of the civilization they were defending. Small, imperfect, constantly improvised, and entirely theirs. Chapter 7. The Salient. When the wire was breached and held. The 30th of April, 1941. 0500 hours. The southern perimeter of Tobruk, near a piece of high ground, the maps designate as Point 209. It has a name in the Italian survey records, Ras el Medauar, but the men holding the positions nearby call it the escarpment, or the ridge, or nothing at all, because in the dark, it's just ground that slopes upward, and that somebody important has decided must not be lost. The artillery preparation has been going for 20 minutes. It is heavier than anything the garrison has heard in the 3 weeks since Easter. The 2nd 24th Battalion's positions are taking hits. In the war diary, the entry for 0500 reads, "Heavy bombardment, all sectors. Infantry movement observed forward of R21. Rommel had learned things from Easter Monday that he hadn't known before. He'd learned the ditch was real and where it was impassable. He'd learned that his maps were useless at the level of detail a tank commander needs for a night attack. He'd learned that the Australian artillery was registered with a precision that turned the ground inside the perimeter into a prepared killing field for anything that crossed the ditch without infantry support. What he'd also learned, and this is the detail that drove the planning for the late April assault, was that the ditch wasn't uniform. In the weeks between Easter and the end of April, his engineers had managed a more systematic survey of the perimeter's southern and western arc, and they'd found what the Italian engineers' marginal note had been hinting at for months. There were sections of the anti-tank ditch that were shallower than the standard 12 feet. Near posts R27 and R29, the ditch ran to less than 3 feet. Near the Ras el Medauar ridge, in certain sectors, it was effectively absent. The assault on the 30th of April was qualitatively different from the Easter attacks. It was preceded by proper artillery preparation. The breaching operations were planned with engineering support and conducted at multiple points simultaneously to disperse the garrison's defensive fire. The infantry assault that followed the breach was coordinated with armor in a way the Easter attacks hadn't managed. And critically, the point of main effort, the Ras el Medauar escarpment at point 209, was not an arbitrary choice. It was the highest ground on the Tobruk perimeter's inner rim, an elevation of roughly 80 meters above the surrounding desert floor, from which a German forward observation officer could see not just the wire and the red line, but the entire interior of the fortress, the harbor, the supply dumps, the artillery positions that had been invisible to Axis spotters since April. Taking point 209 didn't just breach the perimeter, it gave Rommel eyes inside the fortress. It was worth more than 100 tanks if he could hold it. He held it. That's the part of the Tobruk story that the standard narrative tends to blur past quickly, because it complicates the unbroken fortress framing. Between the 30th of April and the 4th of May, German and Italian forces seized and then successfully retained the salient at Ras el Medauar against a series of Australian counterattacks that were fierce, costly, and ultimately insufficient to recover the lost ground. The 2nd 24th and 2nd 48th Battalions bore the heaviest burden of this fighting, launching multiple company-strength assaults against positions that the Germans were reinforcing continuously. The 2nd 48th Battalion lost 28 men killed in approximately 8 hours on the 3rd of May alone. The pattern was consistent across several days. Artillery preparation, infantry assault up the escarpment slope, temporary seizure of forward positions, German counterattack with armor support, withdrawal. The garrison absorbed the fighting without breaking. It didn't recover the high ground. The war diary entry for post R21 on the 3rd of May is one of the documents that stays with me. It reads in the spare, typewritten shorthand of military record keeping. 0310. Post R21 does not respond to scheduled radio check. 0415. Counterattack ordered toward R21 sector. Between 0310 and 0415, there is a gap of 65 minutes in the written record, during which post R21 was simply silent. What happened in those 65 minutes? To the men in that post, in the darkness, on ground that was being contested at close range, is not in the war diary. The war diary records what the battalion headquarters knew. What the men at R21 knew is lost, or buried in accounts that were never filed, or carried in the memory of men who may or may not have spoken about it later. The silence in the documentary record is its own form of evidence. The strategic consequence of the lost salient was immediate and measurable. From point 209, German artillery spotters could now call accurate fire on harbor facilities that had previously been beyond observed range. The harbormaster's records from May 1941 onward show a marked increase in the precision of incoming fire on the docks and fuel storage areas, a correlation that is difficult to explain by any mechanism other than direct ground observation from the captured escarpment. The garrison adapted. Supply operations at the harbor were increasingly restricted to night hours. Fuel dump locations were shifted, and the ferry service's unloading procedures were adjusted to reduce the time ships spent in the harbor during daylight. All of this was manageable. None of it was free. Every adjustment added friction, added time, added risk. The salient's capture didn't break the garrison. It just made everything slightly harder from that day until the siege ended. When I was cross-referencing the post-battle assessments of the May fighting with the official Australian history's treatment of the same events, I found what seems to me a genuine interpretive disagreement that neither source fully acknowledges. The official historian Barton Maughan describes the loss of the salient as a setback that was not recoverable within the resources available, a frank acknowledgement of tactical failure. Chester Wilmot's contemporaneous account, written while the siege was still ongoing, frames the same events as evidence of elastic defense working correctly. The garrison absorbed the penetration, contained it, and prevented it becoming a breakout. Both framings contain truth. Maughan is correct that the ground was never recovered. Wilmot is correct that the containment prevented catastrophe. What neither fully examines is the price paid in the 2nd 48th and 2nd 24th Battalions during those counterattack days in early May, a price that falls almost entirely on a small number of units and a small number of men, and that doesn't distribute evenly across the garrison-held narrative. The Ras el Medauar Salient remained in German hands for the rest of the siege. Point 209 flew, for 7 months, above a fortress that was simultaneously successfully defended and partially occupied by the enemy. The popular framing of Tobruk as a perimeter that was never broken is technically accurate in the sense that the garrison was never overrun, the harbor never fell, and the defensive line never collapsed entirely. But a section of the escarpment inside that perimeter was held by German observation posts from May until December, and from those posts, for 7 months, Axis spotters looked down on the town and harbor of Tobruk and called in fire on what they could see. The unbroken fortress narrative is true at one scale. At the scale of Point 209, it requires qualification. The fighting in the salient period produced casualties that fell disproportionately on specific units. The 2nd 48th Battalion, the 2nd 24th Battalion, and elements of the 2nd 23rd bore the overwhelming weight of the counterattack operations in early May. A veteran of the 2nd 24th Battalion, interviewed for the DVA's oral history program decades later, described the salient fighting as the point at which the siege changed character, the point at which the confidence of the Easter victory gave way to a different understanding of what the next 7 months would require. "The Easter business, we won that," he said, as recorded in the transcript. "The salient, we stopped it, but we didn't win it, and we knew they'd be back." That distinction between winning and stopping is the emotional register of the garrison's middle period, not despair, not triumph. A clear-eyed assessment of a situation that was sustainable but not comfortable, and that was going to continue for a long time. The artillery exchange that characterized the siege's daily rhythm intensified after the salient's capture, partly because of the improved German observation, and partly because both sides had settled into the attritional logic of a siege that neither could resolve quickly. In the period May through August of 1941, the garrison's 25-pounder batteries fired consistently throughout each 24-hour period, with peaks during periods of observed enemy movement and a continuous harassment program designed to prevent the Axis forces from working comfortably in the open. The ammunition expenditure records for this period show a consumption rate that put persistent pressure on the ferry service's delivery capacity. Each 25-pounder round weighed approximately 11.5 kilograms, 9,000 rounds in a 5-day period. The expenditure during the salient fighting represented more than 100 tons of artillery ammunition alone. The ferry, on its nightly runs, was keeping pace with a siege that was eating its supplies faster than a single destroyer could replace them. Chapter 8. The Poles, Soldiers Without a Country. The middle of August 1941, a convoy of ships moving through darkness toward Tobruk harbor. Below decks, in the mess spaces and troop compartments that smell of salt water and diesel and the particular staleness of men who have been at sea too long, the soldiers of the Polish Independent Carpathian Rifle Brigade are making ready to disembark. They've been told to expect artillery on the way in. They've been told the harbor operates without lights. Most of them have been at war for nearly 2 years already, in 3 countries, under 2 defeats. They're not nervous about the artillery. They're thinking about what it means to defend someone else's fortress in someone else's country when your own country is gone. The route that the Carpathian Brigade followed to Tobruk is not the kind of journey that fits neatly into a military logistics summary. After the German invasion of Poland in September of 1939, elements of the Polish army evacuated through Romania and Hungary, many traveling clandestinely, using false papers, moving at night, carrying whatever weapons they could conceal. These men reformed in France, fought in the French campaign of 1940, evacuated again after France's collapse in June of 1940, and reconstituted in Syria under French Mandate authority. When the Vichy-aligned Syrian administration moved to intern them, the brigade refused. They marched to British-controlled Palestine instead. By the time they reached Tobruk in August of 1941, the average soldier had been continuously at war for 22 months, had been defeated twice, and had not seen his family since the autumn of 1939. They brought with them their own chaplains, their own regimental traditions, and a quality of motivation that had no equivalent in the garrison, because they were not defending anything they still possessed. They were fighting for something that had been taken. General Stanislav Kopansky, commanding the brigade, wrote in his post-operation reports with a reflective precision that is unusual in the genre of military after-action documents. He noted the brigade's personnel statistics with a specificity that tells you he understood what those numbers meant. Of approximately 5,400 officers and men, roughly 3,200 were veterans of the September 1939 campaign. Approximately 800 had served in France, and none had been home since the beginning of the war. The average time in operational theater, as of August 1941, was more than 20 months. These figures appear in the administrative section of the report, among the routine personnel data. But they aren't routine. They're the record of an army that had no home to return to, no leave destination, no reference point for normal life. They were fighting with a ferocity that had nothing to do with military doctrine and everything to do with the mathematics of loss. The brigade assumed responsibility for a 29-kilometer sector of the Tobruk perimeter, a frontage that was, by the NATO planning standards that would be developed a decade later, approximately triple the recommended density for sustained defensive operations. 3 times the standard frontage, with a formation that had been in the field for 2 years without a rotation. The brigade compensated for the extended frontage with the same tool Mooreshead had established for the garrison as a whole: aggressive patrolling that made the space between the wire and the Axis positions actively contested rather than passively observed. What the Polish accounts describe as vengeance raids, deep penetration patrol actions designed to capture prisoners for intelligence and to deny the Axis forces any settled comfort in their forward positions, were in fact a systematic extension of the garrison's standard patrol doctrine, applied with an intensity that several Australian battalion commanders noted in handover documents as remarkable given the circumstances. The circumstances being that the men conducting the raids were simultaneously maintaining a 29-kilometer defensive line. The weapons the brigade carried to Tobruk reflected the improvised logistics of an exile army. British-supplied Lee Enfield rifles, Bren guns, and 2-pounder anti-tank weapons formed the standard infantry armament. But the Poles also carried surviving examples of the WZ-35 anti-tank rifle, a Polish-designed weapon firing a 7.92 mm armor-piercing round at a muzzle velocity capable of penetrating 33 mm of armor at 100 meters. Against the Panzer III, this was technically marginal. The frontal armor of the Panzer III exceeded the WZ-35's penetration capacity. But against wheeled vehicles, armored cars, and light Italian tanks, it remained effective, and the brigade's crews used it persistently in the anti-vehicle role, engaging German and Italian transport and reconnaissance vehicles at the perimeter wire with a weapon that had been designed for a different war and a different enemy. The WZ-35 was, arguably, the only surviving Polish military technology of the 1930s that functioned effectively in the North African theater. The Poles carried it anyway. It was theirs. What the Polish-Australian relationship inside Tobruk produced, and this is documented in a consistency across the DVA oral histories that makes it difficult to dismiss as post-war sentimentality, was something that the official records of coalition operations almost never capture. Genuine personal friendship across language barriers, between men who were in Tobruk for entirely different reasons, but were in Tobruk together. A veteran of the 2nd 13th Battalion described, in a recorded interview, Polish soldiers teaching Australians the game of shachmat, chess, using a board scratched into the surface of an ammunition crate, and pieces fashioned from whatever materials the underground spaces provided. The Australians, in return, apparently attempted to explain cricket using a bat improvised from a piece of timber. The explanations of cricket were, by the veteran's account, not entirely successful. The chess was more translatable. In the Polish Institute of National Remembrance's archive, there is a category of document from the Carpathian Brigade's Tobruk period that has no equivalent in the Australian or British collections. They are letters written by Polish soldiers to family members in German-occupied Poland. Letters that were never sent because there was no postal route to occupied Poland, because the writers had no reliable knowledge of whether their families were alive, because posting a letter from a British military base to a home under German occupation was impossible in any practical sense. The soldiers wrote them anyway, Some were found in personal effects after their owners' deaths. Some were preserved by unit chaplains and handed to the brigade's administrative records. They exist in the archive as unsent documents, completed communications to which there was never a response, because the response was structurally impossible. Reading them, even in translation, you understand something about what it means to write to someone you may never see again, across a silence that isn't silence, but occupation. The Poles' role in the final days of the siege, specifically in Operation Crusader's Endgame, is one of the genuinely contested historical questions in the Tobruk literature, and the contention breaks along national lines in a way that itself reveals something about how siege narratives are constructed. Polish accounts, including the Institute of National Remembrance's detailed assessments, argue that it was the Carpathian Brigade's capture of Akroma and its subsequent link with advancing elements of the British Eighth Army that constituted the decisive ground action ending the siege. British Eighth Army records give primacy to the armored link-up from the exterior. Neither account suppresses the other entirely. Both contain documented facts. What they disagree about is which documented fact was the operative one. The siege ended in a process, not a moment, and the process had multiple participants. The difficulty is that siege narratives, like all military narratives, require a climax, and the climax requires a protagonist. The Poles and the British have been arguing about the casting since December of 1941, and the argument is not fully resolved. To me, the most telling detail in the entire Polish Tobruk record isn't a battle action or a casualty figure. It's the unsent letters. When I was working through the IPN's documentation of the brigade's personnel records, I found the reference to these letters mentioned almost in passing, a note in the administrative correspondence about chaplain-held personal effects. The archive entry describes them as correspondence prepared for dispatch, held pending available postal route. That bureaucratic language, pending available postal route, is the official description of a situation that had no resolution. There was no postal route. There would not be one. The letters were pending the end of a war and the survival of the people they were addressed to, neither of which the writers could know about from inside a siege in Libya. The phrase, pending available postal route, is, in its way, the loneliest sentence in the Tobruk archive. The Carpathian Brigade's casualty figures for the Tobruk period, 22 killed, 107 total casualties, according to the Polish Institute's records, are modest in absolute terms compared to the Australian losses, a reflection partly of the brigade's shorter operational period at Tobruk, and partly of the different tactical intensity of their sector during the period of their deployment. But the figures tell only part of the human cost. The men who served at Tobruk with the Carpathian Brigade and survived carried the specific weight of the exile soldier, the knowledge that the war they were fighting was personal in a way that no amount of military doctrine could neutralize. They were fighting for a country they couldn't go back to, a language that was being suppressed in their homeland, families whose fates they couldn't know. The official recognition of the Carpathian Brigade as co-holders of the Rats of Tobruk designation by the Rats of Tobruk Association in Australia is formally correct and historically appropriate. That it has not substantially penetrated the popular Australian memory of the siege is a gap in the national story that this series has been, in part, constructed to address. Chapter 9. The Radio War, Lord Haw Haw and the Gift of a Name. Sometime in June of 1941, a cave beneath the Tobruk escarpment, a battery-powered wireless receiver is picking up a medium-wave signal from a transmitter somewhere in German-controlled Europe. The signal quality is variable. The ionospheric refraction that makes medium-wave broadcasts travel further at night also makes them fade and crackle in ways that require the listener to lean close and fill in the gaps. The broadcast is in English. The voice is polished, slightly theatrical, with an accent that sits uneasily between British and something else. The voice is telling the garrison of Tobruk what it is. The garrison is listening. And then the garrison starts to laugh. William Joyce, Lord Haw Haw, as the British public had named him for the pretentious quality of his radio manner, was an American-born fascist propagandist of Irish descent who had been broadcasting from Berlin since the beginning of the war. He had, by the summer of 1941, built a listenership that extended across the Allied world, partly because his broadcasts occasionally contained accurate information about Allied military movements that the official censorship had suppressed, and partly because there was a specific quality of psychological discomfort in listening to a voice from the enemy's side describe your situation that a significant portion of the audience found, perversely, compelling. Across the Mediterranean, receivable after dark on medium-wave sets, his broadcasts reached the garrison of Tobruk with a regularity that the technical parameters of nighttime medium-wave propagation made almost routine. The phrase that entered history, "the poor desert rats of Tobruk," was intended as contempt. Joyce's rhetorical framework positioned the garrison as trapped, burrowing, subterranean creatures unable to escape their hole, dependent on the thin lifeline of their naval supply for survival. The framing wasn't entirely wrong as a description of the tactical situation. The garrison was underground, was dependent on naval supply, and was not going anywhere. What Joyce failed to understand, and this failure tells you something important about the distance between propaganda designed in a Berlin studio and its reception by men actually living the situation being described, was that the garrison didn't experience underground living as degradation. They'd built a cinema down there. They had a debating society. They'd adapted to the caves with the same practical ingenuity they'd applied to everything else. The word rat landed not as an insult, but as a description that the men found, on examination, reasonably accurate and entirely unashamed. The adoption of the rat's identity happened with a speed that itself tells a story. Within days, the oral histories are not precise about the timeline, and neither is the documentary record, which is itself interesting. The phrase was circulating through the garrison in a form that had been inverted from taunt to badge. Men stenciled it onto ammunition crates. They wrote it in letters home. Chester Wilmot, who was inside Tobruk and whose reports were among the first to carry the phrase to an outside audience, recorded it as a fait accompli. The garrison had decided what it was, and the decision had been made with the characteristic Australian tendency to absorb an insult, examine it for accuracy, and if accurate, keep it. The Anzac Day Commemoration Committee's archive holds a clipping from an Australian newspaper of approximately July 1941, with the headline, "Nazis call our men rats, diggers pleased." The word pleased is underlined in pencil. The identity had already arrived home. The technical mechanism by which Joyce's broadcasts reach the garrison is worth establishing precisely because it grounds the story in physical reality rather than radio mythology. Medium-wave signals, in the frequency range of 500 to 1600 kilohertz that commercial and international broadcasters of the 1940s used, travel along the Earth's surface during the day, but are refracted back to Earth by the ionosphere at night, a phenomenon called skywave propagation that dramatically extends their effective range after dark. A transmitter in Germany, broadcasting in the frequency range that German international propaganda services used, would produce reliable skywave reception across the Mediterranean basin after approximately 2200 local Libyan time. The garrison's wireless sets, primarily British military communications equipment, supplemented by commandeered Italian civilian receivers, were capable of receiving these frequencies. The men could choose, on any given night, between the BBC's international service and Lord Haw Haw. Many chose both, for reasons that aren't entirely explicable by rational information-seeking behavior, but are entirely explicable by human psychology. The speed at which the rat's identity moved from its origin point in the garrison to the Australian domestic public record was approximately 90 days. The first confirmed newspaper appearance in Australian print was in July of 1941. By August, it was appearing in parliamentary correspondence. By September, it had been used in a BBC international broadcast audible in Australia. By October, the phrase was in official War Cabinet documents, used without explanation or attribution, treated as a term that required no introduction. The propagandistic chain from a Berlin studio mockery to a national identity marker ran through Chester Wilmot's dispatches, the garrison's own adoption of the phrase, the ferry service's mail runs, the naval wireless traffic, and the newspaper editors, who recognized that Rats of Tobruk was better copy than any alternative. It took 3 months. In the information environment of 1941, 3 months was fast. What I find most interesting about the Lord Haw Haw episode, and this is the kind of detail that only becomes visible when you're looking at the propaganda history alongside the military history simultaneously, is that Joyce's intended audience for the broadcast was probably not the garrison itself. The strategic purpose of calling the defenders rats was to lower morale among the British and Australian civilian population at home, to frame the garrison as besieged, diminished, and probably doomed in a way that would erode public support for continuing the North African campaign. The garrison was, in this reading, the vehicle for the message rather than its primary recipient. If that interpretation is correct, then Joyce's miscalculation was even more complete than it appears. His attempt to frame the garrison as trapped and diminished for a civilian audience ended up giving the garrison a name that the civilian audience adopted as a badge of pride. The propaganda operation ran in precisely the opposite direction to the one intended. Joyce was captured in Germany in May of 1945, tried for treason in Britain, and hanged on the 3rd of January, 1946. The court records of his trial are extensive, and they include his own statements about his broadcasting career. He does not appear to have publicly acknowledged the Tobruk naming episode or its inversion. Whether he knew, in his final months, that the phrase he'd used as a taunt had become one of the most recognizable identity badges of the Allied war effort in the Pacific and Mediterranean. A term used in official documents, regimental histories, and parliamentary records isn't documented. The silence on the point is itself suggestive. It's the kind of irony that a man facing execution for treason might prefer not to dwell on. The Rats of Tobruk Association, which maintained a formal institutional presence in Australia from the late 1940s onward, managed the legacy of the name with a specific kind of institutional gravity, a formal membership, a registered badge, and a clear criterion for inclusion. You had to have been inside the perimeter during the siege, not in the vicinity, not in the supply chain. Inside. The strictness of that criterion reflects something important about what the name meant to the men who held it. It was not a general commendation for service in the North African theater. It was a specific, geographic, temporal identity. You had been there, during that period, inside that perimeter. That was the entire qualification. It made no distinction between Australians and Poles, between infantry and artillerists, between the men who'd been there from the first day and the men who arrived in August. If you were in Tobruk during the siege, you were a rat. The name that Lord Haw had intended as a diminishment had become, in the hands of the men it described, one of the most precisely defined military identities of the Second World War. The medium-wave wireless sets that received Lord Haw's broadcasts also received the BBC's news bulletins, cricket scores, and music programs. Several oral histories describe the garrison's wireless listeners tuning between the BBC and German international broadcasts on the same evenings, treating both as information sources with different editorial biases. The sophistication of this approach, consuming hostile propaganda alongside friendly programming, applying independent judgment to both, is not what Joyce or Goebbels had intended their broadcasts to produce. It suggests that the garrison, by mid-1941, had developed a media literacy about propaganda that was, arguably, more sophisticated than anything the information ministries of either side had anticipated. They'd been at it long enough to know the difference between what a voice says and what it means. The Rats had learned, among other things, to read their enemy's text against the grain. Chapter 10. Churchill versus Curtin, the political siege within the siege. London, Canberra, 2 desks, 2 cables, August of 1941. Outside the formal language of diplomatic correspondence, a disagreement is happening between 2 men who both believe they are right about the fate of approximately 14,000 soldiers who are 14,000 kilometers from Canberra and 3,000 kilometers from London, and who are not being directly consulted about the matter. This is how alliance politics works. This is how it has always worked. The soldiers know what they need. The governments argue about what is strategically possible. The soldiers wait. The rotation crisis of August 1941 had its origins in a medical reality that Morshead had been documenting since June. His formal reports to Middle East Command were not rhetorical documents. They contained specific figures, disease incidence rates, casualty accumulations, the effective operational strength of units that had been in continuous siege conditions for 4 months without relief. By July, the numbers told a consistent story. The garrison was functioning, but at an effective strength below its nominal order of battle, with a medical burden that was not decreasing and a cumulative psychological toll, what the records described in period language as operational fatigue, that made rotation not a comfort measure, but an operational necessity if the formation was to remain militarily effective. Morshead reported this because it was his professional obligation to report it. What happened to the report after it left his desk was no longer in his control. The cable that Winston Churchill sent to the Australian government in the third week of August of 1941 is a careful document from a man who understood diplomatic language at a level few of his contemporaries matched. He argued that the naval operation required to rotate the Australian garrison was dangerous, demonstrably true, given the losses already sustained, and that the disruption to the garrison's cohesion during a rotation might create vulnerability at the perimeter. He argued that the 9th Division should stay. What the cable didn't contain was any acknowledgement that the rotation request had originated in a formal military assessment by the division's own commander. Churchill's framing treated the Australian War Cabinet's demand as primarily a political calculation rather than an operational recommendation. The Australian Cabinet's framing treated Churchill's resistance as primarily a strategic convenience that happened to cost Australian lives rather than British ones. Both framings contained enough truth to be genuinely held by the people advancing them. John Curtin had become Australian Prime Minister in October of 1941, replacing Robert Menzies, whose earlier engagement with the Tobruk question had been less assertive on the sovereignty dimension. Curtin's government was navigating several political pressures simultaneously. A domestic audience that was becoming increasingly concerned about Australian casualties in what some regarded as a British-managed theatre, a Labour Party base with traditional suspicions of imperial military arrangements, and a genuine strategic anxiety about the Pacific that made the disposition of Australian forces in the Middle East a live question of national security as well as alliance management. His response to Churchill's August cable used the word intact in reference to the 9th Division's survival as a formed operational unit, not its presence in Tobruk, but its existence as a coherent military formation capable of future operations. Churchill had used intact to mean the opposite, keeping the garrison in place. Same word, opposite definitions. The historical debate about who was actually driving the rotation demand, Morshead's operational assessment or Canberra's political calculation, is not fully resolved by the available record. David Horner's biography of Morshead suggests, on the basis of sources that are not entirely conclusive, that Morshead himself may initially have preferred to keep his division together in Tobruk rather than be rotated out piecemeal, on the grounds that divisional coherence as a military formation had operational value that a partial rotation would compromise. If that reading is accurate, the political demand from Canberra preceded and shaped the military recommendation rather than the other way around. The operational assessment became the justification for a decision that had been made on political grounds first. I find this reading partially convincing, but ultimately unverifiable from the public record, and the medical evidence from the garrison's own files is consistent enough with genuine operational exhaustion that I'm unwilling to dismiss it as purely cover. The truth is probably somewhere in the ambiguous space between operational necessity and political imperative, a space that both governments had reason to obscure in their documentation. The rotation itself, conducted in phases between August and October of 1941, was a logistical operation of considerable complexity. The basic mechanism, moving men out and men in simultaneously, at night, through a harbor under Axis air observation, required synchronizing the naval ferry schedule with the infantry handover on the perimeter. The departing Australian units had to brief their replacements, elements of the British 70th Division, on every feature of their sector: patrol routes, enemy positions, minefield layouts, artillery registration points, water point locations, communication frequencies. This briefing process, conducted in darkness on a live perimeter, is documented in the handover records held at the Australian War Memorial. The documents are technical, precise, and extraordinary in what they represent. The compressed knowledge of months of daily observation, transferred from one formation to another in the span of a few nights, while both formations were simultaneously under potential fire. The 2nd 13th Battalion wasn't rotated. The naval schedule closed before their extraction window arrived, and Operation Crusader's commencement in November of 1941 meant the window didn't reopen. The battalion that had fought at Post R33 on Easter Monday night, that had earned the first Australian Victoria Cross of the war, that had been in Tobruk since the 9th of April, That battalion was still inside the perimeter when the siege ended in December. Not by choice, not by design, by a scheduling accident. The most symbolically powerful presence in the entire garrison, the unit there from first to last, acquired that distinction because a naval calendar ran out of available nights. The records are clear on this. The mythology is less clear, because the mythology needs the endurance to be chosen, and the truth is that it wasn't. The political consequence of the rotation dispute extended well beyond Tobruk itself. The precedent Curtin established, that Australia would assert its sovereign right to direct the disposition of its own forces, even within an Allied command structure, even at the cost of tension with London, was not an abstract diplomatic position. It was a practical reorientation of the relationship between Australia and Britain that would have consequences for the rest of the war, and arguably, for the character of Australian strategic policy for decades afterward. The cable exchange of August 1941 didn't create Australian military sovereignty, but it exercised it, formally, in writing, in a crisis, in a way that couldn't be undone or reclassified as merely consultative. What was lost in the rotation debate, and this is rarely examined in the political histories of the episode, was the welfare of the men who were not rotated. The 2nd 13th Battalion soldiers who remained inside Tobruk through September, October, and November of 1941 knew that their comrades had gone out. They knew the rotation had happened and that they were still there. The war diary entries from this period have a quality of compressed awareness about their situation that is different from the entries of the earlier months, a knowledge that the political and military process had worked for most of the garrison and had not, for reasons that had nothing to do with their performance or their condition, worked for them. The battalion continued its operations. The patrols went out. The positions were held. The record is one of unbroken professional function. What the record doesn't capture is what it cost to maintain that function while knowing that the ships had come for everyone else. Chapter 11. Rommel's frustration. The siege that wasn't winning. The 18th of June, 1941. Somewhere in the desert south of Tobruk. Rommel is writing to his wife. He writes to her regularly, brief, compressed letters that give a different picture of his mental state than the operational orders and the post-war memoirs. In the published collection of his correspondence, the entry for approximately this date reads, "Tobruk still holds. I had hoped this would be decided by now. The supply situation is difficult." 3 sentences, no punctuation after the third one. The full stop is missing, and I find myself wondering whether that's an editorial convention in the published collection, or whether the pen simply stopped. By June of 1941, Tobruk had been holding for 2 months, against a commander who had not previously held anywhere. The supply situation he mentions was not incidental context. It was the central operational reality of the entire North African campaign, and Tobruk was its primary cause. Rommel's minimum daily supply requirement for sustained offensive operations, including fuel, ammunition, food, water, and vehicle replacement parts, was estimated at several hundred tons. The delivery route ran from Tripoli eastward along the coastal road, approximately 1,500 kilometers to the forward positions near the Egyptian frontier. For every ton of fuel that reached the front, Italian and German transport records consistently indicate that considerably more than a ton was consumed in the delivery itself. The mathematics worsened with distance. The mathematics worsened with heat. And every kilometer of that road existed because Tobruk's harbor had not fallen. Operation Battle Axe, the British attempt to relieve Tobruk from outside in June of 1941, was defeated by Rommel at Halfaya Pass, in a battle that demonstrated with clinical precision the capability of the German 88mm flak gun in the anti-tank role. The Flak 18's projectile left the barrel at approximately 840 meters per second, and could penetrate 80 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. The British Matilda II's frontal armor ran to 78 millimeters, effective against every other Axis anti-tank weapon in the theater, but technically penetrable by the 88 at medium range. At Halfaya Pass, the British lost 9 Matildas to 88mm fire in the opening phase of the assault. The tactical shock was immediate, and the operational consequences were severe. The British armored force, stripped of its most protected element, could not sustain the advance. Battle Axe failed. Tobruk remained besieged. What the Battle Axe failure meant for Rommel's strategic position is rarely examined in the German perspective histories with the directness it deserves. He had now defeated 2 external relief attempts and repulsed 3 internal assaults on the perimeter. By conventional military logic, this should have been a position of strength. But the perimeter he'd failed to take was costing him 3 divisions in siege duty. Elements of the 15th Panzer, the 21st Panzer, and the Brescia Infantry Division were essentially immobilized around Tobruk's circumference, consuming fuel and maintenance without advancing. Approximately 40% of his committed force was tied to a siege he couldn't conclude, while the British and Egypt were receiving reinforcements by sea and rebuilding the armored strength he'd destroyed at Battle Axe. Every month Tobruk held, the relative balance shifted slightly against him. The supply crisis that Tobruk imposed on the Africa Corps was not merely a matter of distance, it was a matter of loss rate. Allied air power, operating from Egypt and Malta, intercepted Axis convoys crossing the Mediterranean with increasing effectiveness through the summer and autumn of 1941. Italian shipping records for this period show significant tonnage losses to air and submarine attack on the Tripoli route. The fuel and supplies that weren't sunk had to cover 1,500 kilometers of road before they reached Rommel's frontline units. The Africa Corps War Diary records, from multiple periods in the summer of 1941, forward fuel reserves running to less than 48 hours of operational consumption. 48 hours. For a force built on mobility and the ability to exploit tactical opportunities faster than the enemy could respond, 48 hours of fuel meant no exploitation, no pursuit, no follow-through. The Stukas could still fly, the Panzers could still fire, but they couldn't move freely. The post-war debate about whether Rommel's decision to maintain the siege of Tobruk after Easter was strategically rational or a sunk cost trap that he couldn't escape is one of the genuine unresolved questions in the North African historiography. Von Mellenthin, in his memoir, offers the most articulate defense of Rommel's position, that bypassing Tobruk and driving on Egypt with an active, aggressive, well-supplied enemy fortress across his rear and supply line was an unacceptable risk, and that the siege was therefore a strategic obligation rather than a choice. The Italian High Command's contrary position, bypass Tobruk, drive on the Suez Canal before British reinforcements arrive, may, in retrospect, have been the strategically correct call. An advance in the spring of 1941, before the Eighth Army had reconstituted, might have achieved objectives that became progressively harder to reach as the British rebuilt. Rommel chose the siege. The Italian generals chose differently, and their choice was overridden. The argument is not settled. When I was working through the correspondence between Rommel and his wife from the summer and autumn of 1941, I found a gradual evolution in the register of his references to the Australian garrison that is itself a kind of evidence. In April, the references are dismissive. He expected Tobruk to fall, and the Australian unit he was facing was a newly formed division without a combat record. By June, as the letters I cited earlier show, the tone has shifted toward tight-jawed acknowledgement. By September, after the Australians had rotated out and been replaced by British units, there are references in the correspondence to the quality of the opposition that are explicitly respectful. The frequently cited quote attributing to Rommel the observation that he would use Australians to take Hell and New Zealanders to hold it is of uncertain attribution. It doesn't appear with reliable sourcing in the primary documents, and I'm treating it as apocryphal. But the sentiment it expresses is consistent with the evolution visible in the documented correspondence. He was not the same man about Australian soldiers in November that he had been in April. The 3 divisions that Rommel had committed to the siege by mid-1941 were not merely immobilized, they were aging. Desert operating conditions degraded every mechanical system at a rate that European conditions did not produce. Sand infiltrating bearings and gearboxes, heat cycling cracking seals and hoses, the absence of adequate workshop facilities in the forward area, meaning that breakdowns accumulated rather than being repaired. The Panzer Regiment that had entered Tobruk with 38 operational tanks in April was not, by October, in a condition to repeat that operation, even if the tactical situation had permitted it. Every month of siege duty cost the Africa Corps in readiness, in ways that the personnel casualty figures alone didn't capture. The machines were wearing out. The harbor that Tobruk's port represented, its 11-meter depth, its cargo capacity, its position on the coastal road, remained the central strategic fact throughout all of this. Rommel understood it. His logistics officers understood it better. The captured Italian port facility, if operational under Axis control, would have reduced the overland supply haul by more than 1,000 kilometers and eliminated the worst of the fuel mathematics that were strangling his operational flexibility. The garrison inside the perimeter were not, most of them, aware of this calculation. They knew they were being asked to hold a place that mattered, the specific mechanism of why it mattered, the fuel ratios, the harbor depths, the shipping tonnages, was above the operational level at which most of them were working. They held the harbor because they'd been told to hold it. That was sufficient. The arithmetic worked without their needing to know it. Chapter 12. Snipers, Stars, and Sand. The Human Texture of the Long Summer. 0400 hours. The last hour of darkness before the desert begins its daily rearrangement of light and shadow. A two-man sniper post, somewhere in the red line wire, has been in position since before midnight. The observer's notebook shows 6 hours of annotations in pencil, vehicle movements, the angle of a new sandbag emplacement, the time at which a specific German position showed a light. None of this will appear in the battle histories. It will go into the intelligence summary, which will go into the file, which will eventually be transferred to an archive, where it will sit unread for decades. But this morning, in the gray before dawn, it is the most important information in the garrison, because it tells you precisely what changed out there while you were watching. The sniper program that Moorehead's doctrine mandated for the Tobruk garrison is one of the least glamorized and most operationally significant components of the entire siege. The standard framing of sniping is individual: the lone shooter, the single shot, the dramatic elimination. The Tobruk sniper sections operated primarily as an intelligence function, and the shooting, when it occurred, was secondary to the observation. The first pattern 1914 Enfield, converted to .303 caliber and fitted with a scope, either the number 32 Mark I military scope providing 3 times magnification, or commercial alternatives that had made their way to the garrison, was the primary tool. At 600 meters in good desert morning light, before the heat shimmer began distorting the image at roughly 0800 hours, a competent observer could identify a new sandbag emplacement from an old one, a new gun position from an existing shadow, a headquarters vehicle from a supply truck. This was the intelligence the garrison needed, and the sniper sections produced it every morning. The oral history transcripts in the Australians at War Film Archive contain a description of the sniper observation routine that has stayed with me since I first read it. A veteran of the 2nd 48th Battalion, describing his time in the forward observation posts, says, "You'd watch the same bit of wire for 6 hours. You'd know every rock. Every time they moved something, you'd know it. A new sandbag here, a different angle on that gun. You got to know them, not personally, but you knew them like you know someone's habits." That phrase, "like you know someone's habits," is the most accurate description I've encountered of what sustained observation across a fixed piece of ground over months actually produces. It isn't knowledge of a person. It's knowledge of a pattern, and a pattern can tell you almost as much. The daily rhythm of a garrison soldier's existence in the summer of 1941 was organized around the specific constraints that the siege environment imposed. The heat peaked in the early afternoon, regularly exceeding 40 degrees Celsius on the surface, which pushed most activity, patrol preparation, maintenance, supply movement, toward dawn and dusk. The artillery, incoming and outgoing, was intermittent throughout the 24-hour cycle, with no reliable pattern, which meant that habituation rather than avoidance was the practical adaptation. Veterans consistently described developing an unconscious categorical response to sound, the specific acoustic signature of different artillery calibers, the Stuka's distinctive engine note before and during a dive, the difference between distant detonation and incoming trajectory. This sorting of sound into categories of threat level happened, eventually, below the threshold of conscious attention. The garrison slept through some incoming fire because the ears had learned to classify it correctly before the brain had to decide. The watch problem, which appears in several supply manifests from June and July of 1941, is a small logistical detail that opens onto something larger about life inside the perimeter. Mechanical watches were not universally distributed to all ranks. They were rationed, like much else. Men who didn't have watches organized their daily routine by celestial reference, with a precision that several oral histories describe as surprising to themselves. The position of specific star groupings over specific horizon features, cross-referenced with the direction and quality of light, produced a time estimate accurate to within roughly 15 minutes. The men who developed this skill did so because they needed it. Patrol departure times, relief schedules, artillery fire missions, all had to be coordinated against a shared temporal framework that couldn't rely on everyone having a watch. The desert sky above Tobruk in the summer of 1941 was performing a navigational service for a garrison that had partially run out of the instruments ordinarily used for that purpose. The source conflict in the Tobruk accounts about the existence of informal truces, unwritten agreements not to fire during water carrying or at certain predictable times of day, is a disagreement that runs through the secondary literature without full resolution. Several post-war accounts describe tacit arrangements in quieter sectors, particularly in the Italian-held sections of the perimeter. Chester Wilmot's contemporaneous account acknowledges the phenomenon, but attributes it specifically to Italian rather than German-held sectors. The 2nd 48th Battalion's war diary contains no evidence of any truce arrangement in the sectors it occupied, and 2 specific entries record sniper and artillery fire exchanged during periods that a truce narrative would have described as protected. I don't think the truce accounts are fabricated, but I think they've been generalized from specific and limited incidents into a broader narrative about the chivalric character of the Desert War that the primary record doesn't uniformly support. The Desert War was not uniformly chivalric. It was sometimes, in some places, by some units, conducted with a mutual tolerance that developed naturally from shared vulnerability. That's different from a pattern. The smell of the Tobruk siege is documented with a consistency and specificity in oral histories that suggests it became, for the men who experienced it, one of the primary sensory signatures of the entire experience. The combination of unburied dead in no man's land, the distance from the wire and the continuous fire that made recovery impossible in many sectors, with the latrines, the inadequate washing facilities, the cooking smoke, and the specific mineral sharpness that North African desert produces after artillery detonation, created an environment that survivors describe with unusual precision decades later. Several DVA oral histories begin their recollection of Tobruk not with a visual or auditory memory, but with an olfactory one. This isn't a minor detail of atmosphere. It's evidence that the siege registered in multiple sensory channels simultaneously, and that the olfactory channel, connected directly to the memory structures in ways the visual channel isn't, preserved its record with particular fidelity. When I was going through the 2nd 23rd Battalion War Diary for this period, I found a reference to the debating society that stopped me for longer than most archival entries do. The entry records the motion for a specific week's debate as, "This House believes cricket is superior to war." The entry notes the debate was well attended, and that a result was recorded, but doesn't record what the result was. I find the missing result both comic and significant. Someone decided that recording the weekly debate's outcome was worth a column inch in the unit diary. Someone then decided, apparently, that the specific verdict on whether cricket was superior to war didn't need to be preserved for posterity. This is the kind of gap in the archive that drives researchers quietly mad. But the gap itself is data. A group of men under siege found the question of cricket versus war genuinely debatable, formal enough to require a chairman and timed speeches, and significant enough to include in the unit's official record. The missing verdict doesn't diminish that. The underground newspaper that Chester Wilmot called the Tobruk Truth, produced by a former Melbourne journalist serving with the 9th Division on a mimeograph machine that had made its way to the garrison by means the logistics record doesn't fully explain, is one of the most significant undiscovered primary sources in the Tobruk archive. Wilmot mentions it. Multiple oral histories confirm it. The AWM's collection records suggest that copies may exist in the archival holdings that have not been digitized. I've spent time searching for reproduced content and found fragments, quotations in secondary accounts, brief descriptions in memoirs, but no complete edition in any accessible form. This matters because a newspaper, even a single mimeographed sheet produced in a cave, is a record of what the garrison considered important enough to report, significant enough to comment on, and funny enough to print. It's a primary source about the garrison's collective interior life in a way that official documents can't be. The summer of 1941 in Tobruk was not, in the operational record, a period of major tactical development. The big battles, Easter, the Salient, were behind the garrison. Operation Crusader was still months away. The perimeter held, the ferry ran. The patrols went out every night. The artillery exchanged fire every day. Nothing decisive happened. But nothing decisive not happening for 6 months is itself an achievement of a specific and demanding kind. It required a garrison to maintain its military effectiveness, its medical function, its supply infrastructure, its morale, and its operational doctrine, under conditions of continuous, low-level threat and high-level physical discomfort, with no obvious endpoint and no certainty of relief. The men in the sniper posts watched their patch of wire. The men on patrol walked their routes. The men in the caves tended their underground world. Outside, Rommel was running out of fuel. Inside, the garrison was running low on water, but not on patience. Both sides were waiting for something to change. What changed it, eventually, came from London and Cairo, not from the perimeter itself. Chapter 13. One letter. The scale of private loss. The 7th of June, 1941. Somewhere beneath the Tobruk escarpment, a man is writing. The letter is addressed to his mother. It's been censored already, or it will be before it goes out on the next ferry run. The censor's pen will remove specific words, but it won't change the quality of what the man is trying to say, which is not military information. It's the distance between where he is and where he comes from, translated into the only medium available to him. A page, a pen, borrowed light, and the hope that the ferry will run before the next artillery barrage finds the harbor. Private Keith Rundle served with the 2nd 13th Battalion, the Australian Imperial Force. His service number was VX 22691. His letter, held in the Australian War Memorials collection in the Personal Papers series, is a document of ordinary specificity. Food, weather, friends in the unit, a question about whether the harvest has been good, a request for news about his dog. One line describes the stars above Tobruk at night as very big and very close. He says he thinks about the farm. The farm was in South Australia, on the York Peninsula. It was where he came from. From the cave in Libya, 338 days after he enlisted, it was what he was thinking about. Not glory, not history, the farm. Keith Rundle was killed by artillery fire on the 19th of July, 1941. He was 22 years old. He is buried in Tobruk War Cemetery, Plot 1, Row A, Grave 19, the first row, near the entrance. Almost every visitor to the cemetery in the years since 1941 has passed his grave first, though they wouldn't have known whose it was unless they were looking. He's been in the first row for more than 80 years. He was 22. He thought about the farm. The letter has a censor's mark in it, a line of black ink approximately 4 words long, between a reference to men in C Company and a phrase that appears to say, "They say it will be over." The redaction is visible. It doesn't hide the letter's meaning, which was never military to begin with. The censor's pen is part of the document now, the mark of the state on a private communication, permanent and unreversible, sitting between the soldier and the person he was writing to. The 4 words that were removed are gone. We don't know what they said. Given their context, they probably named a location or speculated about an operation. The censorship was doing its job. The job cost 4 words that his mother never read. I've been working with military correspondents from various conflicts for long enough to recognize the specific quality of a letter that was written without any expectation of its own historical significance. Keith Rundle's letter has that quality completely. It was written to be read once, in a kitchen in South Australia, by a woman who was worried about her son. It was not written to be cited in a documentary series. It was not written to represent anything beyond itself. The fact that it does now represent something larger, the 2,480 Commonwealth dead buried in the Tobruk War Cemetery, the 832 Australians from the 9th Division alone, is a function of historical circumstance that Keith Rundle had no way of knowing and presumably would not have chosen. He just wanted his mother to know he was thinking about the farm. The official notification of his death arrived at his family home approximately 5 days after the 19th of July, 1941. The Department of Defense telegram used the standard formula of the period. With deep regret, I have to notify you that your son, his rank, his number, his name, has been reported as having died of wounds on the 19th of July, 1941. The phrase, reported as having died, is the telegram's careful grammar under pressure. Its passive voice, conditional, slightly removed from the bare fact. Reported, not confirmed, not declared, as if the administrative distance between the field report and the family notification required a grammatical hedge. It doesn't soften anything. Grief doesn't parse grammar. But the language reveals something about the machinery of official notification. Its need to be precise while also being survivable to read. The chaplain from the 2nd 13th Battalion wrote a separate letter to Rundle's mother, held in the same AWM file. He notes visiting Rundle in the medical post on the 18th of July, the day before the official date of death, and finding him shaken but not without spirit. The one-day discrepancy between the chaplain's visit and the official death date means Rundle lived through the night of the 18th. He was alive on the 18th. The artillery found him on the 19th. Between the chaplain's visit and the telegram is 24 hours that the official record contains but doesn't linger on. The chaplain wrote his letter with the specific tenderness of a man who understands that detail will matter to the woman reading it. He was right. It matters. The Tobruk War Cemetery sits within the modern Libyan city of Tobruk, a port city with a population of roughly 120,000 people, the capital of the Butnin district, with its own history that did not stop in December of 1941. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission has maintained the cemetery continuously since its establishment in the early years of the war, through Libyan independence, through the Gaddafi era, through the civil conflict that began in 2011 and has continued in various forms since. The Commission's maintenance reports note access restrictions during periods of active fighting in the city's vicinity. There have been years when no CWGC representative could enter the cemetery. There have been years when the graves were maintained by local contracted caretakers, operating without external oversight. One recent maintenance report in the CWGC's accessible records names a local caretaker, Mohammed al-Barouni, who maintained the cemetery's plot records and perimeter fence during a period of restricted access, in accordance with Commission standards, without external supervision, for reasons that the Commission's administrative correspondence describes as professional integrity. He is not in any history of the siege. He tends it anyway. The arithmetic of what Keith Rundle's death cost is not calculable in military terms. The 2nd 13th Battalion continued its operations after the 19th of July, without specific notation of his loss, beyond the casualty return. The war diary entry for that date records incoming artillery fire and notes casualties without names. Casualties are recorded by number in the daily summaries, with individual details carried in the separate casualty appendix. He is a number in the daily summary and a name in the appendix. By the end of the siege, the appendix is long. The daily summaries are consistent. The gap between the two, between the daily operational record and the individual human record, is the gap that the historian's obligation requires crossing repeatedly, even when it's uncomfortable. There are 832 names in the 9th Division's casualty records for the period March through December of 1941. Each of them has an equivalent somewhere: a letter written before the fact, a family notification sent after, a chaplain's letter if the paperwork was completed, a grave in a cemetery that has its own ongoing history in a country that wasn't theirs. The 832 are not a statistic. They are 832 individual instances of the same specific loss, each with its own detail, its own date, its own name on a headstone in Plot 1 or Plot 2 or Plot 7 of a cemetery in a Libyan port city that has been through its own wars since. Keith Rundle is Plot 1, Row A, Grave 19. He thought about the farm. He was 22. Chapter 14, Operation Crusader, the rescue that almost wasn't. The 18th of November 1941, 0600 hours, somewhere east of the Tobruk perimeter, 3 British armored brigades are beginning to move. The 8th Army's Operation Crusader has started, the third attempt to relieve Tobruk from the outside, and the largest yet. The garrison inside the wire doesn't know the exact timing. They know something is coming because the pattern of Axis behavior has been changing for days. More vehicle movement, altered patrol routines, the specific tension that experienced soldiers recognize as the enemy expecting action from a direction that isn't the perimeter. The 2nd 13th Battalion's war diary entry for the 18th of November is brief. It notes increased artillery activity. It notes 1 patrol went out and returned. It does not note that 400 kilometers to the east, the 8th Army has started moving, and that what happens in the next 3 weeks will determine whether the men in those positions spend Christmas in Tobruk or somewhere else. The operational plan for Crusader was built on a strategic logic that was sound in outline and considerably more complicated in execution. 3 armored brigades, the 4th, 7th, and 22nd, would drive west and northwest from the Egyptian frontier, destroying the Axis armor in a series of mobile engagements before linking up with a breakout force from the Tobruk garrison. The New Zealand 2nd Division would advance along the coastal axis. The garrison would launch its own internal breakout operations, timed to coincide with the external advance. Simultaneously, the supply mathematics that had been strangling Rommel since April would become decisive. The 8th Army's Egyptian supply base, fed by rail and road from Alexandria, could rebuild faster than the Africa Corps' overland route from Tripoli could match. Crusaders' architects believed they had constructed a situation where the 8th Army's logistical advantage would override Rommel's operational flexibility. They were correct, eventually. The eventually nearly killed the operation first. The Battle of Sidi Rezegh, fought across the 21st and 22nd of November on an escarpment south of Tobruk, was the engagement that came closest to ending Operation Crusader before it achieved its objective. The 7th Armored Division met the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions in a series of tank engagements that were, from the British perspective, catastrophic in terms of immediate vehicle losses. The British lost over 200 tanks in approximately 48 hours, a loss rate that left the 7th Armored's combat effectiveness effectively destroyed as a formed armored force. The 8th Army's operational picture, seen from General Cunningham's headquarters, looked like defeat. 3 armored brigades had become 2 weakened formations. Supply lines were under pressure. The German armor, despite its own losses, was still functioning as a coherent force. General Cunningham's response to the Sidi Rezegh battle is one of the critical command questions of the North African campaign. The documentation, his own communications, Auchinleck's responses, the post-war accounts by both principals, is careful enough that historians have never fully resolved whether Cunningham formally requested authorization to withdraw or was merely considering it when Auchinleck arrived to assess the situation. What is documented is that Auchinleck flew to Cunningham's headquarters on the 25th of November and issued orders that included the instruction to continue the battle without withdrawal. 4 days later, Cunningham was relieved of command and replaced by Major General Neil Ritchie. The official characterization of the relief was that Cunningham had lost confidence in the operation, language chosen carefully enough that it acknowledged a command failure without specifying its exact nature. The garrison inside Tobruk knew nothing of this. Rommel's decision to launch his dash to the wire on the 23rd of November, taking the Africa Corps eastward through the British lines toward the Egyptian frontier to threaten 8th Army's supply routes and rear areas, is the action that most clearly illustrates both his operational genius and its limits. The dash worked tactically. It threw the 8th Army's rear areas into confusion, disrupted supply columns, and briefly created a situation in which Cunningham's nerve broke. But the dash consumed fuel that the Africa Corps couldn't easily replace. At the furthest point of the eastern advance, forward German elements had less than a day's fuel reserve remaining. Had the 8th Army maintained its cohesion, rather than fragmenting under the operational shock, had a formed British armored force intercepted the returning Africa Corps column, Rommel's panzers would have run dry east of the wire. The dash succeeded because of British command paralysis. It wasn't an inevitably winning maneuver. It was a gamble that the British inadvertently helped to succeed. The New Zealand Division's advance along the coastal axis was the operation that finally made the connection. On the 27th of November, the 6th New Zealand Brigade drove north and made contact with the Tobruk garrison's breakout forces at a position called Ed Duda. For the first time in 242 days, soldiers from inside the perimeter and soldiers from outside the perimeter were standing on the same ground. The garrison did not erupt in the kind of dramatic release that the post-war accounts sometimes suggest. The war diary entries from the garrison side on the 27th of November are operational documents. They record the contact, they record the tactical situation, they record the continuation of defensive operations in other sectors. The emotional register of liberation was present in the men conducting the operation. It wasn't yet in the paperwork. The connection made on the 27th of November was not stable. Rommel's return from the wire dash brought Axis forces back to the Tobruk area in strength, and the ground link was contested for several days. Partially severed, partially held, fought over in a series of engagements that prevented the siege from being declared formally lifted until early December. The garrison's internal operations continued throughout this period, with the Carpathian Brigade and the British 70th Division units that had replaced the Australians conducting their sector's defense while simultaneously participating in breakout operations toward the link-up point. The Polish accounts of this period describe fighting at Akroma, the position whose capture the Poles argue was the decisive ground action of the siege's end, with a specificity that places their units at the critical juncture. The British 8th Army's records describe the armored link-up as the decisive action. Both sets of records are accurate. The argument is about which action was operative. The source conflict about what ended the siege, the internal breakout, the Polish capture of Akroma, the external armored link-up, or the formal relief on the 10th of December, is not resolvable by reference to any single document, because the end of the siege was a process that unfolded across several weeks and involved multiple simultaneous operations by forces approaching from different directions. What the conflict reveals is how important the climactic moment is to the narrative of a military operation, and how aggressively different national accounts compete for the role of protagonist at that moment. The Australians, having mostly left in October, aren't in this particular argument. The Poles and the British have been having it, in various forms, since December of 1941. Chapter 15. The Gate Opens, 10th of December, 1941. The 10th of December, 1941, 1600 hours. The El Adem Road, running south from Tobruk through the perimeter wire. The 2nd 13th Battalion is moving, not retreating, not advancing, moving out. 242 days after they arrived at this perimeter, they are walking through the gate in the late afternoon light, carrying their weapons and their equipment in the same organized, deliberate way they have conducted every other movement since April. The war diary entry for this moment reads, "Unit advised siege officially lifted. Perimeter remains under garrison control, pending formal handover. No unusual activity. Officers instructed to ensure all personal equipment is prepared for movement." The departure time is recorded as 1748 hours. 4 sentences, no exclamation, no formal acknowledgement that these are the last 4 sentences written by an officer who is no longer besieged. The night before the relief, the 9th of December, the 2nd 13th Battalion sent out its final night patrol from the Red Line. The patrol route was identical to the one used on the 141st Patrol before it, and the 140th before that. The same loop through no man's land east of the El Adem Road. The same sequence of reference points, the same timing. The men conducting it had walked this specific ground dozens of times each, in darkness, at intervals of days, for 8 months. They knew where every German position was, where the mines were, which rocks could be used as cover. They'd built this knowledge the way you build any detailed knowledge of a place, by returning to it repeatedly, over time, in different conditions, until the map in your mind is more reliable than the map on paper. They walked the route on the night of the 9th, returned at 0230 hours, and filed their report. The entry is identical in format to the one before it. Nothing marks it as the last. The relief itself, the formal handover of the Tobruk perimeter to incoming 8th Army units on the 10th of December, was conducted according to the military procedure that the garrison had applied to every sector handover since the rotation in August. Outgoing units briefed incoming units on every feature of their positions: enemy dispositions, minefield locations, patrol routes, water points, communication frequencies, artillery registration data. The 2nd 13th Battalion's handover document, filed in the AWM archive, runs to 14 pages of typed notes and hand-drawn sketch maps. 14 pages. Every patrol route they'd walked, every German position they'd identified, every section of wire they'd maintained, compressed into a document that was handed to soldiers who'd never seen the ground, and who would have to learn in days what the 2nd 13th had learned across 242 days. The document is, in a military and human sense, the complete accumulated knowledge of one unit's experience of a siege, everything they'd learned, in the only form they had available to pass it on. Chester Wilmot's account of the relief, written in 1943 and drawing on his contemporaneous notes, describes scenes of considerable emotion: men weeping, men embracing, men shouting at the sky. Several DVA oral histories recorded from veterans decades later describe something more ambivalent. Strange is a word that appears in multiple accounts. Quiet is another. A veteran of the 2nd 13th, interviewed in the 1990s, described the relief as something like the sudden removal of a weight he hadn't been fully aware he was carrying, followed by a disorientation that took days to resolve. The thing that had organized every waking hour for 242 days was simply gone, and in its absence, there was a specific kind of vacancy that wasn't relief exactly, or not only relief. It was the feeling of a structure being removed from around you, and discovering that you'd been standing inside it for so long that you'd partly become it. What the incoming units found in the underground spaces of Tobruk is documented in fragments across several sources. The projector from the underground cinema was still in the cistern, still operational. Several issues of the Tobruk Truth newspaper were in the space that had served as a distribution point. There was a cricket bat, improvised from a piece of ammunition crate. There was, in the underground room where the 2nd 23rd Battalion's debating society had met, a handwritten roster listing the motions debated over several months. The last recorded motion, according to this roster as described in post-war accounts. This house believes Tobruk is sufficient adventure for one lifetime. The result of that debate isn't recorded. It doesn't need to be. The soldiers of the incoming formation, elements of the 4th Indian Division, occupied the caves and used them as they found them, including the cinema projector, including the generator. They screened the films that were still in the cistern, in the same space where Australian soldiers had watched them for months. There are accounts in the Indian Army records of troops finding the projector and assembling to watch a film in the same underground room. The chaplain short that the Australians had watched, in a different army, under different colors, in the same rock. The garrison's underground civilization continued briefly in the hands of men who hadn't been there for any of it. The thing the Australians had built survived them by at least a few weeks. This is not sentimental. It's a fact about what people make when they're given enough time in one place, and what outlasts them. The men who walked out of Tobruk on the 10th of December were not the same men who had arrived in the first week of April. This is a statement so obvious that it risks saying nothing, but the specific nature of the change is worth trying to identify, even knowing that identification is approximate. They were thinner. The medical records are clear on that. The nutritional deficit of the siege ration over 8 months was measurable in body weight. They were medically compromised in specific ways: residual effects of sandfly fever, chronic eye conditions from the fly-borne infections, skin conditions from the months without adequate water for washing. They had an auditory habituation to artillery that would take time to reverse. Several accounts describe difficulty sleeping in quiet billets in the weeks after the relief. And they carried, in their sensory memory, a specific landscape, the particular quality of desert light at 0500, the smell of the escarpment after rain, the sound of a 25-pounder firing on registered target number 47, the weight of the red line wire under a hand-checking tension at 2 in the morning. The 2nd 13th Battalion walked out through the gate at 17:48 hours on the 10th of December. They had been inside for 242 days. Not one day of those 242 had been voluntary. They were soldiers ordered to hold, and they held. Not one day of those 242 was wasted on drama or performance, in the way that the post-war films suggested. They were men doing a job in a specific place, under specific conditions, applying a specific doctrine, trying to stay alive and complete the task. They were not larger than life. They were exactly life-sized. Human beings responding with the full range of human capability to a situation that required the full range. That is all the siege ever was. That is enough. Chapter 16. The Legacy Contested. How Tobruk was Remembered and Misremembered. Sydney, 1944. A cinema. The film playing is The Rats of Tobruk, produced by Charles Chauvel with the cooperation of the Australian Department of Information, with 2 serving officers from the 9th Division's Public Relations section as technical advisors. The audience watching it includes, in some cinemas, men who were actually there. They're watching a version of what they lived. The sand is the right color. The heat looks approximately right. The actors are better looking than the men they're playing, which is always the case. And something is missing. Several things are missing. The men who were there can see the gaps. The audience that wasn't there cannot, because you can only see what's absent if you know what should be present. The production of the film in 1944, 2 years before the war ended, while men from the 9th Division were still fighting in the Pacific, tells you something about the purpose the film was designed to serve. It was not a historical document. It was a present-tense morale instrument, constructed to sustain a civilian population's support for a continuing conflict by celebrating a victory that had already been achieved. This is a legitimate and arguably necessary function of wartime filmmaking. And Chauvel was a skilled enough director to produce something genuinely affecting within the constraints the function imposed. The constraints were significant. The Department of Information's cooperation meant that certain representations were expected and others were not possible. The film that emerged from those constraints shows a siege that is predominantly Australian, largely uncomplicated in its relationships, eventually triumphant, and peopled by men who are frightened sometimes, but never broken. The Poles are not in the film. The Indian artillery regiments are not in the film. The British 73rd Anti-Tank Regiment and the British 339th Royal Horse Artillery are not in the film. The Czechoslovak anti-aircraft gunners who served in the perimeter are not in the film. The HMAS Parramatta's 138 dead are not in the film. The Ras el Medauar Salient, which remained in German hands throughout the siege, is not in the film. The Curtin-Churchill rotation dispute is not in the film. The near failure of Operation Crusader, the relief of Cunningham from command, the dash to the wire that came within a day's fuel of destroying the relief operation, none of this is in the film. What is in the film is the part of the story that serves the purpose the film was built to serve. This isn't a condemnation of Chauvel. It's a description of how institutional memory works. When I look at the two serving officers listed as technical advisors in the NFSA catalog entry for the film, both from the 9th Division's Public Relations section, neither from the 2nd 13th Battalion, the absence is significant. The men who had the most complete knowledge of the siege's full 242 days, the men who had been inside from Easter Monday to the 10th of December, were still fighting when the film was made. Their knowledge wasn't available to the production. The technical advice that shaped the film's representation came from officers who had been rotated out in August and September of 1941. The film's version of Tobruk was authorized by men whose Tobruk had ended before the rotation crisis, before the November fighting, before the final days. The technical advisors didn't know the whole story. They told the part they knew. The longest siege in British military history, claim that appears in the Rats of Tobruk Association's materials and in many secondary accounts, deserves examination, because the precision of historical claims matters. The siege of Ladysmith in the South African War lasted 118 days. The siege of Mafeking lasted 217 days. Tobruk, at 242 days, was longer than both. But the siege of Kut in the First World War lasted approximately 147 days and ended in capitulation. The claim that Tobruk was the longest siege in British or Commonwealth military history is defensible if qualified. It was the longest siege that ended in relief rather than surrender or abandonment, which is a specific and meaningful distinction. The unqualified superlative risks the kind of imprecision that invites challenge, and the challenge undermines the broader account unnecessarily when the qualified version is both accurate and more interesting. The Indian soldiers who served in the Tobruk garrison are perhaps the most comprehensively absent from the popular memory of the siege. The 18th King Edward's Own Cavalry, operating in the armored car role on the perimeter, conducted continuous patrol operations throughout the siege, with casualty rates proportionate to the Australians. Their war diaries are in the British National Archives. Their contribution is documented. It appears in almost no published account of the siege that is not specifically focused on Indian Army history. The selectivity is not the product of deliberate exclusion. It's the product of a national narrative's natural tendency to foreground national actors. But the tendency has a cost, which is that the Tobruk story that most Australians know is smaller than the Tobruk that actually existed, and the men who don't appear in it are no less dead for the absence. The veteran watching the 1944 film who said he didn't recognize it, "It was good-looking blokes on clean sand. We were lean as whippets. We smelled," was performing a specific act of historical witness that official documentation rarely does. He was noting the gap between the record and the experience, not to diminish the record, but to insist on the experience's specificity and its resistance to representation. The film was made from the outside looking in. He had been inside. The two perspectives aren't reconcilable. They both exist. The historian's job is to hold them simultaneously, without collapsing one into the other. The Rats of Tobruk Association maintained its formal institutional presence until the last confirmed members of the living generation were gone. a process that extended into the early years of the 21st century as the final veterans reached the end of their lives. The administrative records of the association's dissolution are not publicly prominent. There was no formal state occasion marking the end of the generation, no equivalent of the cenotaph ceremony for the last known Anzac. The association continues in custodial form, managed by descendants and historical representatives. Its archives have been transferred to the Australian War Memorial. The living connection, the thing that makes the distinction between we were there and they were there, is gone. What remains is the record. Chapter 17. What the Desert Kept. Tobruk, Libya. Sometime in 2019, a maintenance report is being filed. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission's contracted local caretaker has completed his regular inspection of the Tobruk War Cemetery. The grass growth is limited by water access constraints. Headstones in rows C through F require re-leveling due to ground subsidence. The perimeter fence is intact. The access road needs work. Plot records are current. The caretaker's name is Mohammed al-Barouni. He's maintained this cemetery through periods when no Commonwealth official could enter the city, through the disruptions of the civil conflict that has been running in various forms in Libya since 2011, without external supervision, without the presence of the national governments whose dead he tends. He appears in no history of the Tobruk siege. He is the most recent person to have actively cared for the graves of the men this series has been about. The Tobruk War Cemetery holds 2,480 Commonwealth burials from the Second World War. Of these, 749 are Australian, 1,204 are British, 22 are Polish. The remainder are soldiers from India, South Africa, and other Commonwealth nations. The cemetery sits within the modern city of Tobruk, approximately 2 kilometers from the harbor, whose 11-meter depth, this series has argued, was the reason the siege happened. The city's current population is roughly 120,000 people. The cemetery is a piece of Australian, British, and Polish national heritage, located inside a Libyan municipality that has its own ongoing history, its own ongoing dead from its own ongoing conflicts, and its own relationship to the ground that is entirely separate from the military history that outsiders have superimposed on it. The headstones of the men killed between April and December of 1941 are made from Portland limestone, quarried in Dorset, shipped to North Africa as part of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission's immediate post-conflict marking program in the early 1940s. Over more than 80 years of exposure to Libyan coastal conditions, salt spray from the Mediterranean, high ultraviolet radiation, sand-laden winds, the limestone has weathered. The Commission's maintenance reports note that inscription depths in the oldest headstones have decreased significantly, with some inscriptions now requiring close inspection to read. The physical text that records these men's names is slowly being taken back by the environment. Not fast, not catastrophically, slowly, the way all things in deserts are slowly taken. Keith Rundle's headstone in Plot 1, Row A, Grave 19, has been there since approximately 1942. The letters of his name are 80 years old. They're still there. They're going. The archaeological survey conducted in the Tobruk area in the years before 2011 identified surviving remnants of the original Italian-built and Australian-occupied perimeter. Concrete weapons pits, the R-post network, flush with the desert floor as Mooreshead had inherited them, were found beneath the accumulated desert surface. The anti-tank ditch, in sections, was still present as a topographic feature. Wire fragments from the original perimeter were recorded at multiple locations. Inside one of the concrete pits, the survey team photographed scratched graffiti on the interior wall. Among the inscriptions, 213th BN, April 41. No name, just the unit and the date. The 2nd 13th Battalion, who held Post R33 on Easter Monday night, who stayed for 242 days, who walked out through the El Adam Gate at 17:48 hours on the 10th of December. They scratched their name into the concrete before they left. The concrete kept it. The city of Tobruk has been through its own sieges since 1941. The Libyan civil war that began in 2011 involved fighting in and around the city, contested control of its port facilities, and periods of aerial bombardment that would have been recognizable in structure, if not in scale, to the men who experienced the 1941 siege. The harbor. The 11-meter harbor that this series began with has continued to function as a port through multiple conflicts, multiple governments, and multiple disruptions. Geography doesn't care about history's opinions of it. The harbor is still the same depth. It's still the only deep water facility on that stretch of coast. The strategic facts that made 1941 happen are unchanged. What's changed is the human context around them. The source dispute about whether the siege lasted 242 or 253 days, a question of whether you count from the first contact to the first external link-up on the 27th of November, or to the formal relief on the 10th of December, is worth naming not because the resolution matters operationally, but because it reveals something about how we count. Counting requires a decision about what counts as a beginning and what counts as an end. The men inside the perimeter experienced the siege as a continuous present that had a beginning, the 9th and 10th of April, 1941, and an end, the day their unit walked out through the gate. The end date was different for different units. The Australians who rotated out in August and September had their end in a different month than the 2nd 13th Battalion, which had its end in December. The siege, experienced from the inside, had as many end dates as it had units. 242 is the number for the last unit out. That seems right. When I look at the CWGC's program for maintaining war cemeteries in conflict zones, a document that the Commission has developed in response to the inaccessibility of sites in Ukraine, Libya, and other active conflict areas, I find the Tobruk cemetery cited as a model for what the Commission calls remote maintenance protocols. The combination of local contracted caretaking, satellite imagery monitoring, and scheduled access for inspection when security conditions permit. The program was developed partly in response to the access problems at Tobruk during the Libyan civil war, and partly in anticipation of similar problems at other sites. What it represents, in institutional terms, is the Commission's acknowledgement that the obligation to maintain these cemeteries doesn't terminate when the political conditions become difficult. Mohammed al-Barouni, tending the graves when no one from London or Canberra can enter the city, is not a workaround. It's the system working as designed. The farm on the York Peninsula in South Australia, where Keith Rundle grew up, and which he thought about from a cave in Libya in June of 1941, is, as of the time this series was researched, still a working property. It isn't marked on any public map as significant. There's no memorial, no designation, no heritage listing that connects it to the Tobruk War Cemetery, or to Plot 1, Row A, Grave 19. It's a farm. It produces things. The people who work it know their own history with it, which may or may not include knowing that a 22-year-old who grew up on its ground lies in a Libyan cemetery 80 years later, in the first row, with his name in limestone that is very slowly being returned to the desert. He thought about the farm. The farm didn't know he was thinking about it. That's how it goes with the places we carry. They don't know they're being carried. The last ferry left Tobruk Harbor on the 10th of December, 1941. The 8th Army's supply system replaced it. The harbor continued to function. The supply numbers changed. The ships changed. The portmaster's logs continued. The harbor continued to be the only deep water facility on that stretch of coast, which it remains. The anti-tank ditch, where it still exists beneath the desert surface, has the specific dimensions that an Italian engineer calculated and partially completed in the late 1930s. 12 feet deep, 12 feet wide, adequate to stop a Panzer III at the approaches where it was finished, inadequate where the pencil note in the margin said it was incomplete. The ditch is still there. The pencil note is in some archive or gone. But the ditch is still there. The concrete pits are still there. The 2nd 13th Battalion scratched their name in one of them. The desert kept it. The desert keeps most things, eventually. It just takes its time. The harbor at Tobruk measures approximately 11 meters at the main berth. It was 11 meters in 1938 when the Italian engineers surveyed it, 11 meters in April of 1941 when the first ferry runs began, 11 meters in December when the last Australian unit walked out through the gate. This series began with that number, and it ends there because the number hasn't changed, and it frames everything that happened between those dates. 11 meters of water, a depth adequate for vessels of several thousand tons, the only facility of its kind for nearly 1,000 kilometers, 242 days, 832 Australians, 22 Poles, the Carpathian Brigade who came from a country that had ceased to exist, the sailors of HMAS Parramatta who went down with the water tanker, The sniper who watched the same piece of wire every morning until he knew its habits. The debating society that argued about cricket. The man who thought about the farm. Plot 1, row A, grave 19. The depth of the water. The length of the ditch. The handwriting in the margins. The pencil mark. All of it, still in the desert, waiting.